Section 50 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 20. The Coming of Greatheart. It was soon after 9 on the following morning that Scott presented himself on horseback at the gate of Dinah's home. It had been his intention to tie up his animal and enter, but he was met in the entrance by Billy coming out on a bicycle, and the boy at once frustrated his intention. "Good morning, sir. Pleased to see you. But it's no good your coming in. The pater's still in bed, and the mater's doing the housework." "And Dinah?" said Scott. The question leapt from him almost involuntarily. He had not meant to display any eagerness, and he sought to cover it by his next words, which were uttered with his usual careful deliberation. "It's Dinah I have come to see. I have a message for her from my sister." Billy's freckled face crumpled into troubled lines. "Dinah has cleared out," he said briefly. "I'm just off to the station to try and get news of her." "What?" Scott said, startled. The boy looked at him, his green eyes shrewdly confiding. "There's been the devil of a row," he said. "The mater is furious with her. She gave her a fearful licking last night, to judge by the sounds. Dinah was squealing like a rat. Of course girls always do squeal when they're hurt, but I fancy the mater must have hit a bit harder than usual. And she's burnt the whole of the trousseau, too. Dinah was so mighty proud of all her fine things. She'd feel that, pretty badly." "Damnation," Scott said, and for the second time he spoke without his own volition. He looked at Billy with that intense hot light in his eyes that had in it the whiteness of molten metal. "Do you mean that?" he said. "Do you actually mean that your mother flogged her? Flogged Dinah?" Billy nodded. "It's just her way," he explained half apologetically. "The mater is like that. She's rough and ready. She's always done it to Dinah. Had a sort of down on her for some reason. I guess she meant business last night when I saw the dog whip had gone out of the hall. I wished afterwards I'd thought to hide it, for it's rather a beastly implement. But the mater's a difficult woman to balk, and when she's in that mood, it's almost better to let her have her own way. She's sure to get it sooner or later, and a thing of that sort doesn't improve with keeping." So spoke Billy with the philosophy of middle-aged youth, while the man beside him sat with clenched hands and faced the hateful vision of Dinah, the fairy-footed and gay of heart, writhing under that horrible and humiliating punishment. He spoke at length, and some electricity within him made the animal under him fidget and prance, for he stirred neither hand nor foot. "And you tell me Dinah has run away?" "Yes, cleared out," said Billy tersely. "It was an idiotic thing to do, for the mater is downright savage this morning, and she'll only give her another hiding for her pains. She stayed away all day once before, years ago, when she was a little kid, and my eye, didn't she catch it when she came back. She never did it again till now." "And you are going to the station to look for her?" Scott's voice was dead level. He calmed the restive horse with a firm hand. "Yes, just to find out if she's gone by train. I don't believe she has, She's nowhere to go to. I expect she's hiding up in the woods somewhere. I shall scour the country afterwards. For the longer she stays away, the worse it'll be for her. I'm sure of that," said Billy uneasily. "When the mater lays hands on her again, she'll simply flay her." "She will not do anything of the sort," said Scott, and turned his horse's head with resolution. "Come along and find her first. I will deal with your mother afterwards." Billy mounted his bicycle and accompanied him, though he did not see how Scott was to prevent any further vengeance on his mother's part. It was a considerable relief to feel that he had enlisted a champion on his sister's behalf, for he was genuinely troubled about her, although the cruel discipline to which she had been subjected all her life had so accustomed him to see her in trouble that it affected him less than if it had been a matter of less frequent occurrence. Scott's reception of this information had somewhat awed him. Like Dinah, he had long ceased to look upon this man as insignificant. He rode beside him in respectful silence. The country lane they followed crossed the railway by a bridge ere it ran into the station road. There was a steep embankment on each side of the line, surmounted by woods, and as they reached the bridge, Billy dismounted to gaze searchingly into the trees. "She might be anywhere," he said. "This is a favorite place of hers because the windflowers grow here. Somehow I've got a sort of feeling—" He stopped short. "Why, there she is!" he exclaimed. Scott looked sharply in the same direction. Had he been alone, he would not have perceived her, for she was crouched low against a thicket of brambles and stunted trees midway down the embankment. She was clad in an old brown mackintosh that so toned with her surroundings as to render her almost invisible. Her chin was resting on her knees, and her face was turned from them. She seemed to be gazing up the line. As they watched her, a signal near the bridge went down with a thud, and it seemed to Scott that the little huddled figure started and stiffened like a frightened doe. But she did not change her position, and she continued to gaze up the long stretch of line as though waiting for something. "What on earth is she doing?" whispered Billy. "There are no windflowers here." Scott slipped quietly to the ground. "You wait here," he said. "Hold my animal, will you?" He left the bridge, retracing his steps, and climbed a railing that fenced the wood. In a moment he disappeared among the trees, and Billy was left to watch and listen in unaccountable suspense. The morning was dull, and a desolate wind moaned among the bare treetops. He shivered a little. There was something uncanny in the atmosphere, something that was evil. He kept his eyes upon Dinah, but she was a considerable distance away, and he could not see that she stirred so much as a finger. He wondered how long it would take Scott to reach her, and began to wish ardently that he had been allowed to go instead. The man was lame, and he was sure he could have covered the distance in half the time. And then, while he waited and watched, suddenly there came a distant drumming that told of an approaching train. "The Northern Express!" he said aloud. Many a time had he stood on the bridge to see it flash and thunder below him. The sound of its approach had always filled him with a kind of ecstasy before, but now, today, it sent another feeling through him, a sudden wild dart of unutterable dread. "What rot," he told himself with an angry shake. "Oh, what rot." But the dread remained, coiled like a snake about his heart. The animal he held became restless, and he backed it off the bridge, but he could not bring himself to go out of sight of that small tragic figure in the old mackintosh that sat so still, there upon the grassy slope. He watched it with a terrible fascination. Would Scott never make his appearance? A white tuft of smoke showed against the gray of the sky. The throbbing of the engine grew louder, grew insistent. A couple of seconds more, and it was within sight, still far away, but rapidly drawing near. Where on earth was Scott? Did he realize the danger? Ought he to shout? But something seemed to grip his throat, holding him silent. He was powerless to do anything but watch. Nearer came the train, and nearer. Billy's eyes were starting out of his head. He had never been so scared in all his life before. There was something fateful in the pose of that waiting figure. The rush of the oncoming express dinned in his ears. It was close now, and suddenly, as a darting bird, Dinah was on her feet. Billy found his voice in a hoarse, croaking cry, but almost ere it left his lips, he saw Scott leap into view and run down the bank. By what force of will he made his presence known, Billy never afterwards could conjecture. No sound could have been audible above the clamor of the train, yet by some means, some electric battery of the mind, he made the girl below aware of him. On the very verge of the precipice she stopped, stood poised for a moment, then turned herself back and saw him. The train thundered by, shaking the ground beneath their feet, and rushed under the bridge. The whole embankment was blotted out in white smoke, and Billy reeled back against the horse he held. "By Jove," he whispered shakily. "By Jove, what a ghastly fright!" He wiped his forehead with a trembling hand and led the animal away from the bridge. Somehow he was feeling very sick, too sick to look any longer, albeit the danger was past. The smoke cleared from the embankment, and two figures were left facing one another on the grassy slope. Neither one of them spoke a word. It was as if they were waiting for some sign. Scott was panting, but Dinah did not seem to be breathing at all. She stood there tense and silent, terribly white, her eyes burning like stars. The last sound of the train died away in the distance, and then, such was their utter stillness, from the thorn bush close to them a thrush suddenly thrilled into song. The soft notes fell balm-like into that awful silence and turned it into sweetest music. Scott moved at last, and at last the birds ceased. It was as if an angel had flown across the heaven with a silver flute of purest melody and passed again into the unknown. He came to Dinah. "My dear," he said, and his voice was slightly shaky, "you shouldn't be here." She stood before him, pillar-like, her two hands clenched against her sides. Her lips were quite livid. They moved soundlessly for several seconds before she spoke. "I was waiting for the express." Her voice was flat and emotionless. It sounded almost as if she were talking in her sleep, and strangely it was that shocked Scott even more than her appearance. Dinah's voice had always held countless inflections, little notes gay or sad like the trill of a robin. This was the voice of a woman in whom the very last spark of hope was quenched. It pierced him with an intolerable pain. "Dinah, Dinah," he said, "for God's sake, child, you don't mean that?" Her white pinched face twisted in a dreadful smile. "Why not?" she said. "There was no other way." And then a sudden quiver as of returning life went through her. "Why did you stop me?" she said. "If you hadn't, it would have been all over by now." He put out a quick hand. "Don't say it. In heaven's name, you are not yourself. Come into the wood and we will talk." She did not take his hand. "Can't we talk here?" she said. He composed himself with an effort. He spoke with quiet insistence. She gave him an inscrutable look. "You think you are going to help me, Mr. Greatheart," she said, "but I am past help. Nothing you can do will make any difference to me now." "Come with me, nevertheless," he said. He laid a gentle hand upon her shoulder, and she winced with a sharpness that tore his heart. But in a moment she turned beside him and began the ascent, slowly, laboringly, as if every step gave her pain. He moved beside her, supporting her elbow when she faltered, steadily helping her on. They entered the wood, and the desolate sighing of the wind encompassed them. Dinah looked at her companion with the first sign of feeling she had shown. "I must sit down," she said. "There is a fallen tree over there," he said, and guided her towards it. She leaned upon him, very near to collapse. He spread his coat upon the tree and helped her down. "Now, how long is it since you had anything to eat?" he said. She shook her head slightly. "I don't remember, but it doesn't matter. I'm not hungry." He took one of her icy hands and began to rub it. "Poor child," he said, "you ought to be given some hot bread and milk and tucked up in bed with hot bottles." Her face began to work. "That," she said, "is the last thing that will happen to me." "Haven't you been to bed at all?" he questioned. Her throat was moving spasmodically. She bowed her head to hide her face from him. "Yes," she said in a whisper. My mother put me there." And then, as if the words burst from her against her will, "She thrashed me first with a dog whip, but the dogs have got hair to protect them, and I had nothing. She only stopped because I fainted. She hasn't finished with me now. When I go back, she broke off. But I'm not going, she said, and her voice was flat and hard again. Even you can't make me do that. There'll be another express this afternoon. Scott knelt beside her and took her bowed head onto his shoulder. Listen to me, Dinah, he said. I am going to help you, and you mustn't try to prevent me. If you had only allowed me, I would have gone home again with you yesterday, and this might have been avoided. My dear, don't draw yourself away from me. Don't you know I am a friend you can trust? The pitiful tenderness of his voice reached her, overwhelming her first instinctive effort to draw back. She leaned against him with painful, long-drawn sobs. He held her closely to him with all a woman's understanding. Oh, don't cry any more, child, he said. You're worn out with crying. I feel so bad, sobbed Dinah. Yes, I know. Of course you do. But it's over. It's over. No one shall hurt you any more. You don't understand, breathed Dinah. It never will be over while I live. I'm hurt inside. I know, he said again, but it will get better presently. Isabel and I are going to take you away from it all. Oh, no, she said quickly. No. She lifted her head from his shoulder and turned her poor stained face upwards. I couldn't do that, she said. I couldn't. Wait, he said gently. Let me do what I can to help you now, before we talk of that. Will you sit here quietly for a little while I go and get you some milk from that farm down the road? I don't want it, she said, but I want you to have it, he made grave reply. Will you stay here? Promise me. Very well, she assented miserably. He got up. I shan't be long. Sit quite still till I come back. He touched her dark head comfortingly and turned away. When he had gone a little distance, he looked back and saw that she was crouched upon the ground again and crying with bitter, straining sobs that convulsed her as though they would rend her from head to foot. With tightened lips, he hastened on his way. She had suffered a cruel punishment, it was evident, and she was utterly worn out in body and spirit. But was it only the ordeal of yesterday and the physical penalty that she had been made to pay that had broken her thus? He could not tell, but his heart bled for her misery and desolation. Who is the other fellow? He asked himself. I wonder if Billy knows. He found Billy awaiting him in the road, anxious and somewhat reproachful. You've been such a deuce of time, he said. Is she all right? She is very upset, he made answer. And she is faint, too, from want of food. That's not surprising, commented Billy. She can't have had anything since lunch yesterday. What shall I do? Run home and get something? The mater can't want her to starve. No, Scott's voice rang on a hard note. She probably doesn't, but you needn't go home for it. Run back to that farm we passed just now and see if you can get some hot milk. Be quick, like a good chap. Here's the money. I'll wait here. Billy seized his bicycle and departed on his errand. Scott began to walk his horse up and down, for inactivity was unbearable. Every moment he spent away from poor broken Dinah was torturing. Those dreadful, hopeless tears of hers filled him with foreboding. He yearned to return. Billy's absence lasted for nearly a quarter of an hour, and he was beginning to get desperate over the delay when at last the boy returned, carrying a can of milk and a mug. I had rather a bother to get it, he explained. People are so mighty difficult to stir, and I didn't want to tell 'em too much. I've promised to take these things back again. I say, can't I come along with you now? I'd rather you didn't, said Scott. I can manage best alone. Besides, I'm going to ask you to do something more. Anything, said Billy readily. Thanks. Well, will you ride this animal into Great Mallows's, hire a closed car, and send it to the bridge here to pick me up? Then take him back to the court, and if anyone asks any questions, say I've met a friend and I'm coming back on foot, but I may not be in to luncheon. Yes, that'll do, I think. I'll see about returning these things. Much obliged, Billy. Goodbye." Billy looked somewhat disappointed at this dismissal, but the prospect of a ride was dear to his boyish heart, and in a moment he nodded cheerily. "All right, I'll do that. I'll hide my bicycle in the wood and fetch it afterwards. But where are you going to take her to?" Scott smiled also faintly and enigmatically. "Leave that to me, my good fellow. I shan't run away with her." "But I shall see her again sometime," urged Billy as he dumped his long-suffering machine over the railing and propped it out of sight behind the hedge. "No doubt you will." Scott's tone was kindly and reassuring. "But I think I can help her better just now than you can, so I'll be getting back to her. Goodbye, boy, and thanks again." "So long," said Billy, vaulting back and thrusting his foot into the stirrup. "You might let me hear how you get on." "I will," promised Scott. End of section 50.
Section 51 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 21. The Valley of Humiliation. When Scott reached the fallen tree again, Dinah's fit of weeping was over. She was lying exhausted and barely conscious against his coat. She opened her eyes as he knelt down beside her. "You are good," she whispered faintly. He poured out some milk and held it to her. "Try to drink some," he said gently. She put out a trembling hand. "No, let me," he said. She submitted in silence, and he lifted the glass to her lips and held it very steadily while slowly she drank. Her eyes were swollen and burning with the shedding of many scalding tears. Now and then, a sharp sob rose in her throat so that she could not swallow. "Take your time," he said. "Don't hurry it." But ere she finished, the tears were running down her face again. He set down the glass, and with his own handkerchief he wiped them away. Then he sat upon the low tree trunk and drew her to lean against him. "When you're feeling better, we'll have a talk," he said. She hid her face with a piteous gesture against his knee. "I don't see the good of talking," she said in muffled accents. "It can't make things any better." "I'm not so sure of that," he said. "Anyhow, we can't leave things as they are. You'll admit that." Dinah was silent. He went on with the utmost gentleness. "I want to get you away from here. Isabel is going down to Heath-on-Sea, and she wants you to come too. It's a tiny place. We have a cottage there, with the most wonderful garden for flowers you ever saw. It isn't more than 30 yards square. And there's a cliff path down to the beach. Isabel loves the place. The yacht is there too, and we go for cruises on calm days. I'm hoping Isabel may pick up a little there, and she's always more herself when you are with her. You won't disappoint her, will you?" A great shiver went through Dinah. "I can't come," she said almost under her breath. "It just isn't possible." "What is there to prevent it?" he asked. She moved a little and lifted her head from its resting place. "Ever so many things," she said. "You're thinking of Eustace?" he questioned. "He's gone already, gone to town. He'll probably go abroad, but in any case, he will not get in your way." "I wasn't thinking of him," Dinah said. "Then of what?" he questioned. "Your mother? I will see her, and make it all right." She started and lifted her face. "Oh, no, oh, no. You must never dream of doing that," she declared, with sudden fevered urgency. "I couldn't bear you to see her. You mustn't think of it. Indeed, indeed. Why, I would even sooner go back myself." "Then I must write to her," he said, gently ceding the point. "It is not essential that I should see her. Possibly, even, a letter would be preferable." Dinah's face had flushed fiery red. She did not meet his eyes. "I don't see why you should have anything to do with her," she said. "You would never get her to consent." "Then I propose we act first," said Scott. "Isabel is leaving today. You can join her at Great Mallows and go on together. I shall follow in a couple of days. There are several matters to be attended to first, but Isabel and Biddy will take care of you. Come, my dear, you won't dislike that so very badly." "Dislike it?" Dinah caught back another sob. "I should love it above all things, if it were possible, but it isn't, is it?" "Why not?" he questioned. "Surely your father would not raise any objection." She shook her head. No, he doesn't care what happens to me. I used to think he did, but he doesn't. "Then what's the difficulty?" asked Scott. She was silent, and he saw the hot color spreading over her neck as she turned her face away. "Won't you tell me?" he urged gently. "Is there some particular reason why you want to stay?" "Oh, no, I'm not going to stay." Quickly she made answer. "I'm never going back. I couldn't after... She broke off in quivering distress. "I think your mother will be sorry presently," he said. "People with violent tempers generally repent very deeply afterwards." Dinah turned upon him suddenly and hotly. "She will never repent," she declared. "She hates me. She's always hated me. And I hate her, hate her. The concentrated passion of her made her vibrate from head to foot. Her eyes glittered like emeralds. She was possessed by such a fury of hatred as made her scarcely recognizable. Scott looked at her steadily for a moment or two, then, "But it does you more harm than good to say so," he said. "And it doesn't answer my question, does it? Dinah, if you don't feel that you can do this thing for your own sake, won't you do it for Isabel's? She's needing you badly just now." The vindictive look went out of Dinah's face. Her eyes softened, and he saw the hopeless tears well up again. "But I couldn't help her any more," she said. "The very fact of having you to care for her would help her," Scott said. Dinah shook her head. She was sitting on the ground with her hands clasped round her knees. As the tears splashed down again, she turned her face away. "It wouldn't help her. It wouldn't help anybody to have me as I am now," she said. "I can't tell you, I can't explain, but I'm not fit to associate with anyone good." Scott leaned towards her. "Dinah, my dear, you're torturing yourself," he said. "It's natural, I know. You've had no sleep, and you've cried yourself ill. But I'm not going to give in to you. I'm not going to take no for an answer. You have no plans for yourself, and I doubt if in your present state you're capable of forming any. Isabel wants you, and it would be cruel to disappoint her. So you and I will join her at Great Mallows this afternoon. I will deal with your people in the matter, but I do not anticipate any great difficulty in that direction. Now that is settled, you need not weary yourself with any further discussion. I am responsible, and I will bear my responsibility." His tone was kind, but it held unmistakable finality. Dinah uttered a heavy sigh and said no more. She lacked the strength for prolonged opposition. He persuaded her to drink some more of the milk, and made a cushion of his coat for her against the tree. "Perhaps you will get a little sleep," he said, as she suffered herself to relax somewhat. "Will it disturb you if I smoke?" "No," she said. He took out his case. "Shut your eyes," he said practically. But Dinah's eyes remained open, watching him. He began to smoke as if unaware of her scrutiny. After several moments, she spoke. "Scott?" He turned to her. "Yes, what is it?" The piteous, shamed color rose up under his eyes. Again, she turned her face away. That sapphire pendant, she murmured. I brought it with me. Of course, I know the presents will have to be returned. I didn't mean to run away with it, but I loved it so. I couldn't have borne my mother to touch it. Shall I give it to you now? No, dear, he answered firmly. Neither now nor at any time. I gave it to you as a token of friendship, and I would like you to keep it always for that reason. Always? Questioned Dinah. Even if I never marry at all? Certainly, he said. Because I shall never marry now, she said, speaking with difficulty. I have quite given up that idea. I should like you to keep it in any case, Scott said. You are very good, she said earnestly. I wonder you will have anything to do with me now that you know how wicked I am. I don't think you wicked, he said. Don't you? She opened her heavy eyes a little. You don't blame me for... She broke off, shuddering, and as she did so, there again came the rumble and roar of a distant train. Then why did you stop me? She whispered tensely. Scott was silent for a moment or two. He was gazing straight before him. At length, I stopped you, he said, because I had to. It doesn't matter why. You would have done the same in my place. But I don't blame you, partly because it's not my business, and partly because I know quite well that you didn't realize what you were doing. I did realize, Dinah said. If it weren't for you, because you are so good, nothing would have stopped me, even now. Again, the hot tears came. I've nothing to live for, and God doesn't care. She turned her face into her arm and wept silently. Scott made a sudden movement and threw his cigarette away. Then swiftly he bent over her. Dinah, he said, stop crying. You're making a big mistake. His tone was arresting, imperative. She looked up at him, almost in spite of herself. His eyes gazed straight into hers, and it seemed to her that there was something magnetic, something that was even unearthly in their close regard. You're making a mistake, he repeated. God always cares. He cared enough to send a friend to look after you. Do you want any stronger proof than that? I don't know, Dinah said, awestruck. Think about it, Scott insisted. Do you seriously imagine it was just chance that brought me along at that particular moment? Do you think it was chance that made you draw back yesterday from giving yourself to a man you don't love? Was it chance that sent you to Switzerland in the first place? Don't you know in your heart that God has been guiding you all through? I don't know, Dinah said again, but there was less of hopelessness in her voice. The shining certainty in Scott's eyes was warring with her doubt. But then, why has he let me suffer so? Why did he suffer so himself? Scott said. Except that he might learn obedience. It's a bitter lesson to all of us, Dinah, but it's got to be learnt. You have learnt it, she said with a touch of her own impulsiveness. He smiled a little, smiled and sighed. I wonder. I've learnt anyhow to believe in the goodness of God, and to know that though we can't see him in all things, it's not because he isn't there. Even those who know him best can't realize him always. But still, you're sure he's there? Dinah questioned. I am quite sure, he said, with a conviction so absolute that it placed further questioning beyond the bounds of possibility. Life is full of problems which it is out of any man's power to solve. But to anyone who will take the trouble to see them, the signs are unmistakable. There's not a single soul that is left unaccounted for in the reckoning of God. He cares for all. There was no contradicting him. Dinah was too weary for discussion in any case. But he had successfully checked her tears at last. He had even, in a measure, managed to comfort her torn soul. She lay for a space, pondering the matter. I'm afraid I am one of those who don't take the trouble, she said at length. But I shall try to now. Thank you for all your goodness to me, Mr. Greatheart. She smiled at him wanly. I don't deserve it, not a quarter of it, but I'm grateful all the same. Please, won't you have your smoke now, and forget me and my troubles? That smile cheered Scott more than any words. He recognized, moreover, that the delicate touch of reserve that characterized her speech was the first evidence of returning self-control that she had manifested. He took out his cigarette case again. I hope you haven't found me over-presumptuous, he said. Dinah reached up a trembling hand. Presumptuous? For helping me in the valley of humiliation? She said. He took the hand and held it firmly. I'm so used to it myself, he said in a low voice. I ought to know a little about it. Perhaps, said Dinah thoughtfully. That is what makes you great. He raised his shoulders slightly. You've always seen me through a magnifying glass, he said whimsically. Some day the fates will reverse that glass, and then you will be unutterably shocked. Dinah smiled again and shook her head. I know you, she said. He lighted his cigarette and then brought out a pocketbook. I want to write a note to Isabel, he said. You don't mind? About me? Questioned Dinah. About the arrangements I'm making. She is motoring to Great Mallows in any case to catch the afternoon express. Oh, said Dinah, and colored vividly, painfully. Scott did not see. I can get someone at the farm to take the message, he said, and once you are with Isabel, I shall feel easy about you. And my mother, faltered Dinah. I shall write to her this afternoon while we're waiting for Isabel, said Scott quietly. What shall you say? Whispered Dinah. Do you mind leaving that entirely to me? He said. She will be furious, she murmured. She might, out of revenge, come after us. What then? She will certainly not do that, said Scott, as she will not know your address. Besides, people do not remain furious, you know. They cool down, and then they're generally ashamed of themselves. Don't let us talk about your mother. The Devins, then, said Dinah, turning from the subject with relief. Tell me what happened. Was the colonel very angry? Scott's mouth twitched slightly. Not in the least, he said. Not really? Dinah looked incredulous for a moment. Then, perhaps he thinks there's a fresh chance for Rose, she said. Perhaps he does, agreed Scott dryly. In any case, he's more disposed to smile than frown, and as Eustace wasn't there to see it, it didn't greatly matter. Oh, poor Eustace, she whispered. It was dreadful to hurt him so. I think he'll get over it, Scott said. He was much kinder than I deserved, she murmured. Scott's faint smile reappeared. Perhaps he found it difficult to be anything else, he said. She shook her head. I wonder how I came to make such a dreadful mistake. It wasn't your fault, said Scott. She looked at him quickly. What makes you say that? He met her look gravely. Because I know just how it happened, he said. You were neither of you in earnest in the first place. I'm afraid I had a hand in making Eustace propose to you. I was afraid, and so was Isabel. You would be hurt by his trifling. And you interfered? Breathed Dinah. He nodded. Yes, I told him it must be one thing or the other. I wanted you to be happy, but instead of helping you, I landed you in this mess. Something in his tone touched her. She lay a small, shy hand upon his knee. It was dear of you, Scott, she said very earnestly. Thank you, ever so much, for what you did. He put his hand on hers. My dear, I would have given all I had to have undone it afterwards. It's very generous of you to take it like that. I've often wanted to kick myself since. Then you must never want to again, she said. Do you know, I'm so glad you've told me. It was so fine of you to do that for me. I'm sure you couldn't have wanted me for a sister-in-law even then." "I wanted you to be happy," Scott reiterated. She uttered a quick sigh. "Happiness isn't everything, is it?" "Not everything, no," he said. She grasped his hand hard. "I'm going to try to be good instead," she said. "Will you help me?" He smiled at her somewhat sadly. "If you think my help worth having," he said. "But of course it is," she made warm answer. "You are the strong man who helps everyone. You are Greatheart." He looked at her still smiling and slowly shook his head. "Now, if you don't mind," he said, "I will write my note to Isabel." End of section 51. Section 52 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 22. Spoken in Jest. The afternoon was well advanced when Scott returned to Perrythorpe Court. No sounds of revelry greeted him as he entered. A blazing fire was burning in the hall, but no one was there to enjoy the warmth. The gay crowd that had clustered before the great hearth only yesterday had all dispersed. The place was empty. "Can I get you anything, sir?" inquired the man who admitted him. His voice was sepulchral. Scott smiled a little. "Yes, please. A whiskey and soda. Where is everybody?" "The Colonel and Miss Rose went out riding, sir, after the guests had all gone, and they have not yet returned. Her ladyship is resting in her room." "Everyone gone but me?" questioned Scott, with a whimsical lift of the eyebrows. The man bent his head decorously. "I believe so, sir. There was a general feeling that it would be more fitting, as the marriage was not to take place as arranged. I understand, sir, that the family will shortly migrate to town." "Really?" said Scott. He bent over the fire, for the evening was chilly and he was tired to the soul. The man coughed and withdrew. Again the silence fell. A face he knew began to look up at Scott out of the leaping flames. A face that was laughing and provocative one moment, wistful and tear-stained the next. He heaved a sigh as he followed the fleeting vision. Will she ever be happy again? He asked himself. The last sight he had had of her had cut him to the heart. She had conquered her tears at last, but her smile was the saddest thing he had ever seen. It was as though her vanished childhood had suddenly looked forth at him and bidden him farewell. He felt he would never see the child Dinah again. The return of the servant with his drink brought him back to his immediate surroundings. He sat down in an easy chair before the fire to mix it. The man turned to go, but he had not reached the end of the hall when the front door bell rang again. He went, soft-footed, to answer it. Scott glanced over his shoulder as the door opened and heard his own name. "Is Mr. Studley here?" a man's voice asked. "Yes, sir. Just here, sir," came the answer, and Scott rose with a weary gesture. "Ah, here you are." Airily, Guy Bathurst advanced to meet him. "Don't let me interrupt your drink. I only want a few words with you." "I'll fetch another glass, sir," murmured the discreet manservant, and vanished. Scott stood, stiff and uncompromising, by his chair. There was a hint of hostility in his bearing. "What can I do for you?" he asked. Bathurst ignored his attitude with that ease of manner of which he was a past master. "Well, I thought perhaps you could give me news of Dinah," he said. "Billy tells me he left you with her this morning." "I see," said Scott. He looked at the other man with level, unblinking eyes. "You're beginning to feel a little anxious about her?" he questioned. "Well, I think it's about time she came home," said Bathurst. He took out a cigarette and lighted it. "Her mother is wondering what has become of her," he added between puffs. "I posted a letter to Mrs. Bathurst about an hour ago," said Scott. "She will get it in the morning." "Indeed?" Bathurst glanced at him. "And is her whereabouts to remain a mystery until then?" "That letter will reassure you as to her safety," Scott returned quietly, "but it will not enlighten you as to her whereabouts. She is in good hands, and it is not her intention to return home, at least for the present. Under the circumstances, you could scarcely compel her to do so." "I never compel her to do anything," said Bathurst comfortably. "Her mother keeps her in order. I have nothing to do with it." "Evidently not." A sudden, sharp quiver of scorn ran through Scott's words. "Her mother may make her life a positive hell, but it's no business of yours." A flicker of temper shone for a second in Bathurst's eyes. The scorn had penetrated even his thick skin. "None whatever," he said deliberately. "Nor of yours either, as far as I can see." "There you are wrong." Hotly, Scott took him up. "It is the duty of every man to prevent cruelty. Dinah has been treated like a bond slave all her life. What were you about to allow it?" He flung the question fiercely. The man's careless repudiation of all responsibility aroused in him a perfect storm of indignation. He was probably more angry at that moment than he had ever been before. Guy Bathurst stared at him for a second or two, his own resentment quenched in amazement. Finally he laughed. "If you were married to my wife, you'd know," he said. "Personally, I like a quiet life. Besides, discipline is good for youngsters. I think Lydia is disposed to carry it rather far, I admit. But, after all, a woman can't do much damage to her own daughter. And anyhow, it isn't a man's business to interfere." He broke off as the servant reappeared and seated himself in a chair on the other side of the fire. He drank some whiskey and water in large appreciative gulps and resumed his cigarette. "If Dinah had seriously wanted to get away from it, she should have married your brother," he said then. "It was her own doing entirely, this last affair. A girl shouldn't jilt her lover at the last moment if she isn't prepared to face the consequences. She knows her mother's temper by this time, I should imagine. She might have guessed what was in store for her." He looked across at Scott as one seeking sympathy. "You'll admit it was a tomfool thing to do," he said. "I don't wonder at her mother wanting to make her smart for it. I really don't. Dinah ought to have known her own mind." "She knows it now," said Scott grimly. "Yes, so it appears. By the way, have you any idea what induced her to throw your brother over in that way just at the last minute? It would be interesting to know." "Did she give you no reason?" said Scott. He hated parleying with the man, but something impelled him thereto. Guy Bathurst, leaning back at his ease with his cigarette between his lips, uttered a careless laugh. "She seemed to think she wasn't in love with him. We couldn't get any more out of her than that. As a matter of fact, her mother was too furious to attempt it. But there must have been some other reason. I wondered if you knew what it was." "I shouldn't have thought it essential that there should have been any other reason," Scott said deliberately. "If there is, I'm not in her confidence." He was still on his feet, as if he wished it to be clearly understood that he did not intend their conversation to develop into anything of the nature of friendly intercourse. Bathurst continued to smoke, but a faint air of insolence was apparent in his attitude. He was not accustomed to being treated with contempt, and the desire awoke within him to find some means of disconcerting this undersized whippersnapper who had almost succeeded in making him feel cheap. "You haven't been making love to her on your own account, by any chance, I suppose?" he inquired lazily. Scott's eyes flashed upon him a swift and hawk-like regard, and the hauteur that so often characterized his brother suddenly descended upon him and clothed him as a mantle. "I have not," he said. "Quite sure," persisted Bathurst, still amiably smiling. "It's my belief she's smitten with you, you know. I've thought so all along. Funny idea, isn't it? Never occurred to you, of course." Scott made no reply, but his silence was more scathing than speech. It served to arouse all the rancor of which Bathurst's indolent nature was capable. "No accounting for women's preference, is there?" he said. "You ought to feel vastly flattered, my good sir. It isn't many women would put you before that handsome brother of yours. How did you work it, eh? Come, you're caught, so you may as well own up." Scott shrugged his shoulders abruptly, disdainfully, and turned from him. "If you choose to amuse yourself at your daughter's expense, I cannot prevent you," he said. "But there's not a grain of truth in your insinuation. I repudiate it absolutely." "My dear fellow, that's a bit thick," laughed Bathurst. He had found the vulnerable spot, and he meant to make the most of it. "Do you actually expect me to believe that you won her away from your brother without knowing it? That's a rather tough proposition, too tough for my middle-aged digestion. You've been trifling with her young affections, but you're not man enough to own it." "You are wrong, utterly wrong," Scott said. He restrained himself with difficulty, for still something was at work within him urging him to be temperate. "Dinah has never dreamed of falling in love with me. As you say, the bare idea is manifestly absurd." "Then who is she in love with?" demanded Bathurst with lazy insistence. "You're the only other man she knows, and there's certainly someone. No girl would throw up such a catch as your brother for the mere sentiment of the thing. It stands to reason there must be someone else, and there's no one but you. She doesn't know anyone else, I tell you. She has no opportunities. Her mother sees to that." Scott was bending over the fire, his face to the flame. His indignation had died down. He was very still, as one deep in thought. Could it be the true word, spoken in ill-timed jest, which he had just heard? He wondered. A golden radiance was spreading forth to him from the heart of those leaping flames, like the coming of the dawn light over the dark earth. He watched it, spellbound, utterly unmindful of the man behind him. If this thing were true, if this thing were true! A sudden sound made him turn to see Colonel Devine and his daughter enter. They came forward to greet him in Bathurst. Rose was smiling. Her eyes were softly bright. "How happy she looks," was the thought that occurred to him. But it was only a passing thought. It vanished in a moment as he heard her accost Bathurst. "How is our poor little Dinah by this time?" "You had better ask this gentleman," airily responded Bathurst. "He has elected to make himself responsible for her welfare." Rose's delicate brows went up, but very strangely, Scott no longer felt in the least disconcerted. He replied to her unspoken query without difficulty. "Dinah felt she could not face the gossips," he said, "and as Isabel was badly wanting her, they've gone away together. Except for old Biddy, they will be quite alone, and it will do both of them all the good in the world." Rose's brow cleared. "What an excellent arrangement," she murmured sympathetically. "And your brother?" Scott smiled. "Needless to say, he's not of the party. His plans are somewhat uncertain. He may go abroad for a time, but I doubt if he banishes himself for long when the London season is in full swing." Rose's smile answered his. "I think he is very wise," she said. "When Easter is over, we shall probably follow his example. I hope we shall have the pleasure of meeting you when we're all in town."
So do I," said the colonel. "You must look me up at the club any time. I shall be delighted."
"You are very kind," Scott said. "But I go to town very rarely, and I never stay there. My brother is far more of a society man than I am." "You will have to come out of your shell," smiled Rose.
Quite so, agreed the colonel. "It isn't fair to cheat society, you know. If we can't dance at your brother's wedding, you might give us the pleasure of dancing at yours."
Bathurst uttered a careless laugh.
I've just been accusing him of cutting his brother out, he said lightly. But he denies all knowledge of the transaction.
Oh, but what a shame, interposed Rose quickly. Mr. Studley, we won't listen to this gossip. Will you come up to my sitting room and show me that new game of patience you were talking about yesterday? Bring your drink with you. He went with her almost in silence. In her own room, she turned upon him with a wonderful, illuminated smile and held out her hand. I won't have you badgered, she said, but it is true, is it not? He took her hand, looking straight into her beautiful eyes. There was more life in her face at that moment than he had ever seen before. She was as one suddenly awakened. What is true, Miss Devine? He questioned. That you care for her, she answered, that she cares for you. His look remained full upon her. In a friendly sense, yes, he said. In no other sense? She insisted. Her eyes were shining, as if her whole soul were suddenly alight with animation. Tell me, she said, as he did not speak immediately. Have you ever cared for her merely as a friend? There was no evading the question, neither, for some reason, could he resent it. He hesitated for a second or two, then, You have guessed right, he said quietly, but she has never suspected it, and she never will. To his surprise, Rose frowned. But why not tell her? She said. Surely she has a right to know. He smiled and shook his head. Pardon me, no one has the smallest right to know. Would you say that of yourself if you cared for someone who did not care for you? She blushed under his eyes suddenly and very vividly, and in a moment turned from him. Ah, but that is different, she said. A woman is different. If she gives her heart where it is not wanted, that is her affair alone. He did not pursue his advantage. He liked her for the blush. Isn't it rather an unprofitable discussion? He said gently. Suppose we get to our game of patience. And Rose acquiesced in silence. End of section 52. Section 53 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 23. The Knight in Disguise. A long, curling wave ran up the shingle and broke in a snow-white sheet of foam just below Dinah's feet. She was perched on a higher ridge of shingle, bare-headed, full in the glare of the mid-June sunlight. Her brown hands were locked tightly around her knees. Her small, pointed face looked wistfully over the sea. She had been sitting in that position for a long time, her green eyes unblinking, but swimming in the heat and glare. The dark ringlets on her forehead danced in the soft breeze that came over the water. There was tension in her attitude, the tension of deep and concentrated thought. Into the midst of her meditations there came a slow, halting step. It fell on the shingle behind her, reaching her above the roar of the breakers, and instantly a flood of color rushed up over her face and neck. She turned sharply. Scott! She was on her feet in a second, with hand outstretched in welcome. Oh, how you startled me! How good of you to come so soon! I shouldn't have left the house if I had known. I came at once, he said simply, but I've only just got here. I saw you sitting on the shore and came straight to you. What news? His quiet, deliberate voice was in striking contrast to her agitated utterance. The hand that held hers was absolutely steady. She met his look with confidence. Scott, she is going. You knew it, didn't you? When you were here last Sunday? She knew it, too. She didn't want you to go, really, and so, directly I realized she was worse, I sent for you. But they say, even now, she may linger for a little. But you'll stay, won't you? You won't go again." His grave eyes looked into hers. "Of course I will stay," he said. She drew a quick sigh of relief. She scarcely slept last night. Her breathing was so bad. It was very hot, you know. The nurse or I were fanning her nearly all the time, till the morning breeze came at last. Then she got quieter. She's asleep now. They say she will sleep for hours. And so I slipped out, just for a little, so as to be quite fresh again when she wakes." "Don't you sleep at all?" Scott asked gently. The color was fading from her face. It returned at his question. "Oh, yes, any time. It doesn't matter for me. I'm so strong. And I can sleep afterwards." He looked down at the thin little hand he still held. "You mustn't wear yourself out, Dinah," he said. Her lip quivered suddenly. "What does it matter?" she said. "I've nothing else to live for." "I don't think we can any of us say that," he answered. "There's always something left." She turned her face and looked over the sea. "I'm sure I don't know what," she said with a catch in her voice. "If Isabel were going to live, if I could only have her always, I should be quite happy. I shouldn't want anything else. But without her? Life without her? After these 2 months—" Her voice broke and ceased. "I know," Scott said. "I should have felt the same myself not long ago. I've let you slip into my place, you see, and it comes hard on you now. But don't forget our friendship, Dinah. Don't forget I'm here." She turned back, swallowing her tears with difficulty, and gave him a quivering smile. "Oh, I know. You are so good. And it was dear of you to let me take your place with her. None but you would have done such a thing." "My dear, it was far better for her, and she wished it," he interposed. "Besides, with Eustace away, I had plenty to do. You mustn't twist that into a virtue. It was the only course open to me. I knew that it would lift her out of misery to have you, and, naturally, I wished it too." She nodded. "It was just like you, and I ought to have remembered that it couldn't last. It's been such a comfort to have my darling to love and care for, but, oh, the blank when she is gone." Scott was silent. "It's wrong to want to keep her, I know," Dinah went on wistfully. "She's got so wonderfully happy of late, and I know it is the thought of nearing the end of the journey that makes her so. And when I'm with her, I feel happy too, for her sake. But when I am away from her, it's all so dreary. I feel so frightened and alone." "Don't be frightened," Scott said gently. "You are never alone." "Oh, but life is so difficult," she whispered. "It would be," he answered, "if we had to face it all at once. But thank God that's not so. We can only see a little way ahead. We can only do a little at a time." "Do you think that is a help?" she said. "I would give anything sometimes to look into the future." "I think the burden would be greater than we could bear," Scott said. "Oh, do you? I think it would be such a relief to know." Dinah uttered a sharp sigh. "It's no good talking," she said. "Only one thing is certain. I'm not going to break with Billy, of course, but I'll never go back to Perrythorpe again. Never as long as I live." There was a quiver of passion in her voice. She looked at Scott with what was almost a challenge in her eyes. He did not answer it. His face wore a look of perplexity. "But if I were in your place," he said quietly, "I think I should say the same." "I am sure you would," she said warmly. "I only tolerated it so long because I didn't know what freedom was like. When I went to Switzerland, I found out, and when I came back, it just wasn't endurable any longer. But I wish I knew. I do wish I knew what I were going to do." The words were out before she could stop them. But the moment they were uttered, she made a sharp gesture as though she would recall them. "I am silly to talk like this," she said. "Please forget it." He smiled a little. "Not silly, Dinah," he said, "but mistaken. Believe me, the future is already provided for." Her brows contracted slightly. "Ah, you are good," she said. "You believe in God." "So do you," he said with quiet conviction. Her lip quivered. "I believe he would help anyone like you, but he wouldn't bother himself about me. There are too many others of the same sort." Scott looked at her in genuine astonishment. "What a curious idea," he said. "You don't really think that, do you?" She nodded. "I can't help it. Life is such a maze of difficulties, and one has to face them all alone." "You won't face yours alone," he said quickly. She smiled rather piteously. "I've faced all the worst bits alone so far." "I know," Scott said, "but you're through the worst now." She shook her head doubtfully. "I'm afraid of life," she said. He saw that she did not wish to pursue the subject and put it gently aside. "Shall we go in?" he said. "I should like to be at hand when Isabel wakes." She turned beside him at once. Their talk went back to Isabel. They spoke of her tenderly, as one nearing the end of a long and wearisome journey. And as they approached the little white house on the heath above the sea, Dinah gave somewhat hesitating utterance to a thought that had been persistently in her mind of late. "Do you," she said, speaking with evident effort, "think that Eustace should be sent for?" "Does she want him?" said Scott. "I don't know. She never speaks of him, but then that may be for my sake." Dinah's voice was very low and not wholly free from distress. "And again, it may be on my account he's keeping away. She hasn't seen him for these 2 months, not since we left Perrythorpe." "No," Scott said gravely. "I know." Dinah was silent for a brief space. Then she braced herself for another effort. "Scott, I don't want to be in anyone's way. If she would like to see him, and if he doesn't want to come because of me, I must go, that's all." She spoke with resolution, and pausing at the gate that led off the heath into the garden, looked him straight in the face. "I want you," she said rather breathlessly, "to find out if that is so. And if it is, "My dear, you needn't be afraid," Scott said. "I am quite sure that Eustace wouldn't wish to drive you away. He might be doubtful as to whether you would care to meet him again so soon, but if you had no objection to his coming, he wouldn't deliberately stay away on his own account. You know, I don't think you've ever realized it. He loves Isabel." "Then he must want to come," she said quickly. "Oh, Scott, do you know, I said a dreadful, a cruel thing to him that last day. If he really loves her, it must have hurt him terribly." "What did you say?" Scott asked. "I said," the quick tears sprang to her eyes, "I said that he was unkind to her and that she was always miserable when he was there. Scott, what made me say it? It was hateful of me. It was hateful." "It was the truth," Scott said. He looked at her thoughtfully for a few seconds. Then, very kindly, he patted her hand as it rested on the gate. "Don't be so distressed," he said. "It probably did him good, even if it did hurt. But I think you are right. If Isabel has the smallest wish to see him, he must come. I will see what I can do." Dinah gave him a difficult smile. "You always put things right," she said. He lifted his shoulders with a whimsical expression. "The magnifying glass again," he said. "No," she protested. "No. I see you as you are." "Then you see a very ordinary citizen," he said. But Dinah shook her head. "A knight in disguise," she said. End of section 53. Section 54 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 24. The Mountainside. When Isabel opened her eyes, after a slumber that had lasted for the greater part of the day, it was to find Scott seated beside her, quietly watching her. She reached a feeble hand to him with a smile of welcome. "Dear Stumpy, when did you come?" "An hour or two ago," he said, and put the weak hand to his lips. "You've had a good sleep, dear?" "Yes," she said. "Yes, it has done me good." She lay looking at him with a smile still in her eyes. "I hope little Dinah is resting," she said. "She was with me nearly all night. I didn't wish it, Stumpy, but the dear child wouldn't leave till I was more comfortable." "She's resting a little for now," he said. "I'm so sorry you had a bad time last night." "Oh, don't be sorry for me," she said softly. "My bad times are so nearly over now. It's a waste of time to talk about them. She sent for you, didn't she?" He bent his head. "She knew I would wish to be sent for. She fancied you might be wanting me." "I do want you," she said, and into her wasted face there came a look of unutterable tenderness. "Oh, Stumpy, darling, need you leave me again?" He was still holding her hand, his fingers closed upon it at her words. "I think the last part may be a little steep," she said wistfully. "I would like to feel that you are near at hand. You have helped me so often, so often. And then, too, there is my little Dinah. I want you to help her, too." "God knows I will do my best, dear," he said. Her fingers returned his pressure. "She has been so much to me, she whispered. "When I came here, I had no hope. But the care of her, the comforting of her, opened the dungeon door for me. And now no giant despair will ever hold me captive again. But I'm anxious about her, Stumpy. There's some trouble in the background of which she has never spoken, of which she can never bear to speak. Have you any idea what it is?" He moved with an unwanted touch of restlessness. "I think she worries about the future," he said. "That isn't all," Isabel said with conviction. "There's more than that. It hangs over her like a cloud. It weighs her down." "She hasn't confided in me," he said. "Ah, but perhaps she will." Isabel's eyes still dwelt upon him with a great tenderness. "Stumpy," she murmured under her breath. "Forgive me for asking. I must ask, Stumpy, why don't you win her for yourself, dear? The way is open. I know you can." He moved again, moved with a gesture of protest. "You are mistaken, Isabel," he said. "The way is not open." He spoke wearily. He was looking straight before him. "If I were to attempt what you suggest," he said slowly, "I should deprive her of the only friend to whom she can turn with any confidence besides yourself. She trusts me now implicitly. She believes my friendship for her to be absolutely simple and disinterested, and I would rather die than fail her." "Then you think she doesn't care?" Isabel said. Scott turned his eyes upon her. "Personally, I came to that conclusion long ago," he said. "No woman could ever hang a serious romance around me, Isabel. I'm not the right sort. If Dinah imagined for a moment that I were capable of making love in the ordinary way, our friendship would go to the bottom forthwith. No, my dear, put the thought out of your mind. The Stumpies of this world must be resigned to go unpaired. They must content themselves with the outer husk. It's that or nothing." Isabel's smile was full of tenderness. "You talk as one who knows," she said.
but I wonder if you do." "Oh, yes," Scott said. "I've learned my lesson. I've been given an ordinary soul in an extraordinary body, and I've got to make the best of it. You can't ignore the body, you know, Isabel. It plays a mighty big part in this mortal life. The idea of any woman falling in love with me in my present human tenement is ridiculous, and I've put it out of my mind for good." Isabel's eyes were shining. She clasped his hand closer. "I think you are quite wrong, Stumpy dear," she said. "If your soul matched your body, then there might be something in your argument. But it doesn't. And, if you don't mind my saying so, your soul is far the most extraordinary part of your personality. Little Dinah found out long ago that you were great-hearted." Scott smiled a little. "Oh, yes, I know she views me through a magnifying glass and reveres me accordingly. Hence our friendship. But, my dear, that isn't being in love. I believe that somewhere there is a shadowy person whom she cherishes in the very inner secrecy of her heart. Who or what he is, I don't know. He's probably something very different from the dream being she worships. We all are. But I feel that he is there. Probably I've never met the actual man. I've only seen his shadow, and that by inadvertence. I once penetrated the secret chamber for one moment only, and then I was driven forth and the door securely locked. I'm not good at trespassing, you know, for all my greatness. I've never been near the secret chamber since." "Do you mean that she admitted to you that she cared for someone?" Isabel asked. Scott's pale eyes had a quizzical look. "I had the consideration to back out before she had time to do anything so unmaidenly," he said. "Possibly the Shadow Man may never materialize. In fact, it seems more than possible. In which case, the least said is soonest mended." "That may be what is troubling her," Isabel said thoughtfully. She lay still for a while, and Scott leaned back in his chair and watched the little pleasure boats that skimmed the waters of the bay. The merry cries of bathers came up to the quiet room. The world was full to the brim of gaiety and sunshine on that hot June day. "Stumpy," gently his sister's voice recalled him. "Do you never mean to marry, dear? I wish you would. You will be so lonely." He lifted his shoulders. "What can I say, Isabel? If the right woman comes along and proposes, I will marry her with pleasure. I would never dare propose on my own, being what I am." "Being a very perfect knight whom any woman might be proud to marry?" Isabel said. "That is only a pose of yours, Stumpy, and it doesn't become you. I wonder, if you are right about Dinah." "Yes, I am right," he said with conviction. "But, Isabel, you will remember it was spoken in confidence." She gave a sharp sigh. "I shall remember, dear," she said. Again, a brief silence fell between them, but Scott's eye no longer sought the sparkling water. They dwelt upon his sister's face. Pale as alabaster, clear-cut as though carven with a chisel, it rested upon the white pillow, and the stamp of a great peace lay upon the calm forehead and in the quiet of the deeply sunken eyes. There were lines of suffering that yet lingered about the mouth, lines of weariness and of sorrow, but the old piteous look of craving had faded quite away. The bitter despair that had so haunted Dinah had passed into the stillness of a great patience. There was about her at that time the sacred hush that falls before the dawn. After a little she became aware of his quiet regard, and turned her head with a smile. "Well, Stumpy, what is it?" "I was just wondering what had happened to you," he made answer. Her smile deepened. "I will tell you, dear," she said. "I have come within sight of the mountain-top at last." "And you are satisfied?" he said in a low voice.
Her eyes shone with a soft brightness that seemed to illuminate her whole face.
"Satisfied that my beloved is waiting for me, and that I shall meet him in the dawning?" she said. "Oh, yes, I have known that in my heart for a long time. It troubled me terribly when I lost his letters. They had been such a link, and for a while I was in outer darkness. Then, by degrees, after little Dinah came back to me, I began to find that, after all, there were other links. Helping her in her trouble helped me to bear my own, and I came to see that ministering to need outside of one's own is the surest means of finding comfort in sorrow for oneself. I have been very selfish, Stumpy. I have been gradually waking to that fact for a long while. I used to immerse myself in those letters to try and get the feeling of his dear presence. Very, very often I didn't succeed. And I know now that it was because I was forcing myself to look back and not forward. I think material things are apt to make one do that. But when material things are taken quite away, then one is forced upon the spiritual, and that is what has happened to me. No one can take anything from me now, because what I possess is laid up in store for me. I am moving forward towards it every day."
She ceased to speak, and again, for the space of seconds, the silence fell. Scott broke it, speaking slowly, as if not wholly certain of the wisdom of speech. "I did not know," he said, "that you had lost those letters." Her face contracted momentarily with the memory of a past pain. "Eustace destroyed them," she stated simply. His brows drew sharply together. "Isabel, do you mean that?" She pressed his hand. "Yes, dear. I knew you would feel it badly, so I didn't tell you before. He acted for the best. I see that quite clearly now, and, in a sense, the best has come of it." Scott got to his feet with the gesture of a man who can barely restrain himself. "He did that," he said. She reached up a soothing hand. "My dear, it doesn't matter now. Don't be angry with him. I know that he meant well." Scott's eyes looked down into hers, intensely bright, burningly alive. "No wonder," he said, breathing deeply, "that you never want to see him again." "No, Stumpy, that is not so." Gently she made answer. Her hand held his almost pleadingly. "For a long time I felt like that, it is true. But now it is all over. There is no bitterness left in my heart at all. We have grown away from each other, he and I. But we were very close friends once. And because of that, I would give much, oh, very much, to be friends with him again. It was in very great measure my selfishness that came between us, my pride, too. I had influence with him, Stumpy, and I didn't try to use it. I simply threw him off because he disapproved of my husband. I might have won him. I feel that I could have won him if I had tried, but I wouldn't. And afterwards, when my mind was clouded, my influence was all gone. I wish I could get it back again. I feel as if I might. But he's keeping away now because of Dinah. And I'm afraid, too, that he feels that I do not want him." Her eyes were suddenly dim with tears. "And it's not so, Stumpy. I do want him. Sometimes, in the night, I long for him. But for little Dinah's sake." She paused, for Scott had suddenly turned and was pacing the room rapidly, unevenly, as if inaction had become unendurable. She lay and watched him while the great tears gathered and ran down her wasted face. He came back to her at length and saw them. He stood a moment looking downwards, then knelt beside her and very tenderly wiped them away. "My dear," he said softly, "you mustn't ever cry again. It breaks my heart to see you."
If you want Eustace, he shall come to you. Dinah was speaking to me about it only a short time ago. She will not stand in the way of his coming. In fact, I gathered that if you wish it, she wishes it also." "That is so like little Dinah," whispered Isabel. "But, Stumpy, do you think we ought to let her face that?" "I shall be here," he said. "Oh, yes, dear, you will be here." She regarded him wistfully. "Stumpy, don't let yourself get bitter against Eustace," she pleaded. "You have always been so splendid, so forbearing till now." Scott's lips were stern. "Some things are hard to forgive, Isabel," he said. "But if I forgive," she said. His face changed. He bowed his head suddenly down upon her pillow. "Nothing will give you back to me when you are gone," he whispered. Her hand was on his head in a moment. "Oh, my dear, are you grieving because of that? And I have been such a burden to you." "A burden, beloved," he said, speaking with difficulty. "And you were getting better. You were better. He threw you back again. He brought you to this." Her fingers pressed his forehead. "Not entirely, Stumpy. Be generous, dear. It may have hastened matters a little, only a very little. And even so, what of it if the journey has been shortened? Perhaps the way has been a little steeper, but it has brought me more quickly to my goal. Stumpy, if it weren't for leaving you, I would go as gladly as a happy bride to her wedding." She broke off, breathing fast. He lifted his head swiftly and saw the shadow of mortal pain gathering in her eyes. He commanded himself on the instant and rose. Self-contained and steady, he found and administered the remedy that was always kept on hand. Then, as the spasm passed, he stooped and quietly kissed the white forehead. "Don't trouble about me, dear," he said. "God knows I would not keep you from your rest." And with that, he calmly turned and left her. But Biddy, whom he sought a few moments later to send her to her mistress, saw in him, notwithstanding his composure, an intensity of suffering that struck dismay to her honest heart. "The Lord preserve us," she said, "but Master Scott has the look of a man with a sword in his soul." She wiped her own tears away with a trembling hand. "And what'll he do at all when Miss Isabel is gone?" she said, "unless Miss Dinah does the comforting of him." End of section 54. Section 55 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 25. The Trusty Friend. The trains from the junction to Heath-on-Sea were few and invariably late. Scott had been pacing the platform for half an hour on the evening of the day that followed his own arrival, ere a line of distant smoke told of the coming of the train he was awaiting. His movements were slow and weary, but there was about him the strained look of a man who cannot rest. There was no gladness of welcome in his eyes as the train drew near. It was rather as if he braced himself for a coming ordeal. He searched the carriages intently as they ran past him, and a flicker of recognition came into his face at the sight of a tall figure leaning from one of them. He lifted a hand in salutation and limped along the platform to meet the newcomer. Sir Eustace was out of the train before anyone else. He met his brother with the impetuosity of one who cannot stop for greeting. "Ah, Stumpy, I'm not too late." There was strain upon his face also as he flung the question, and in an instant Scott's look had changed.
He grasped the outflung hand. No, old fellow, it's all right. She's looking forward to seeing you. Sir Eustace drew a sharp breath. His dark face relaxed a little. I've had a hell of a time, he said. My dear chap, I'm sorry. Impulsively, Scott made answer. I'd have met you at the junction, only it was difficult to get away for so long. Do you mind walking up? They'll see to fetching your traps along presently. Oh, all right. Yes, let us walk, by all means. Eustace expanded his chest and breathed again deeply. He put his hand on Scott's shoulder as they passed through the barrier. What's the matter with you, my lad? He said. Scott glanced up at him, a swift, surprised glance. With me? Nothing. I'm as usual. Eustace's hawk eyes scanned him closely. I've never seen you look worse, he said. Scott raised his shoulder slightly under his hand and said nothing. The first involuntary kindliness of greeting passed wholly away, as if it had not been. Eustace linked the hand in his arm as they walked. Tell me about her, he said. About Isabel. Scott spoke with very obvious constraint. There isn't much to tell. She's just going. These breathless attacks come very frequently, and she's weaker after each one. The doctor says it would not be surprising if she went in her sleep, or, in fact, at any time. And she asked for me. The question fell curtly. Eustace was looking straight ahead up the white, dusty road as he uttered it. Yes, she wanted you. Equally curtly came Scott's reply. He ignored the hand on his arm, limping forward at his own pace and leaving his brother to accommodate himself to it as best he could. Sir Eustace sauntered beside him in silence for a space. They were approaching the heath-clad common that gave the place its name when he spoke again. And Dinah? He said then. Again, Scott glanced upwards, his pale eyes very resolute. Yes, Dinah is still here. Her people seem quite indifferent as to what becomes of her, and Isabel wishes to keep her with her. I hope— He hesitated momentarily. I hope you will bear in mind the extreme difficulty of her situation. Sir Eustace passed over the low words. And what is going to happen to her afterwards? He said. Heavens knows. Scott spoke as one compelled. Sir Eustace continued to gaze straight before him. Haven't you thought of any solution to the difficulty? He asked. What do you mean? Scott's voice rang suddenly stern. A faint smile touched his brother's face. It was like the shadow of his old supercilious sneer. It occurred to me that you, being a chivalrous knight, might be moved to offer her your protection, he explained coolly. You are quite at liberty to do so, so far as I am concerned. I give you my free consent. Scott started, as if he had been stung. Man, don't sneer at me, he said in a voice that quivered. I've a good many things against you, and I'm damned if I can stand any more. There was desperation in his words. Sir Eustace's brows went up, and his smile departed. But there came no answering anger in his eyes. He was silent for several moments, pacing forward, his hand no longer linked in Scott's arm. Then at last, very quietly, he spoke. You're right. You have a good many things against me. But this is not one of them. I was not sneering at you. There was a note of most unwanted sincerity in his voice that gave conviction to his words. Scott turned and regarded him in open amazement. The steel-blue eyes met his with an odd, half-shamed expression. You mustn't bully me, you know, Stumpy, he said. Remember, I can't hit back. Scott stood still. He had never in his life been more astounded. Even then, with the direct evidence before him, he could hardly believe that the old haughty dominance had given place to something different. Why can't you hit back? He said, almost stammering in his uncertainty. Sir Eustace smiled again with rueful irony.
Because I've nothing to hit you with, my son. Because you can break through my defense every time. If I were to kick you from here to the sea, you'd still have the best of me. Haven't you realized that yet?" "I hadn't, no." Scott's eyes still regarded him with a puzzled, half-suspicious expression. Sir Eustace turned from their scrutiny and began to walk on. "You will presently," he said. "The man who masters himself is always the man to master the rest of the world in the end. I never thought I should live to envy you, my boy, but I do." "Envy me? Why? Why on earth?" Embarrassment mingled with the curiosity in Scott's voice. His hostility had gone down utterly before the unaccustomed humility of his brother's attitude. Sir Eustace glanced at him sideways. "I'll tell you another time," he said. "Now look here, Stumpy. You're in command, and I shan't interfere with you so long as you take reasonable care of yourself. But you must do that. It is the one thing I'm going to insist upon. That's understood, is it?" Scott smiled his tired, gentle smile. "Oh, certainly, my dear chap. Don't you worry yourself about that. It isn't of the first importance in any case." "It's got to be done," Sir Eustace insisted. "So keep it in mind." "I haven't been doing anything, you know," Scott protested mildly. "I only came down yesterday." "That may be, but you haven't been sleeping for some time. You needn't trouble to deny it. I know the signs. What have you been doing at Willowmount?" It was a welcome change of subject, and Scott was not slow to avail himself of it. They began to talk upon matters connected with the estate, and the personal element passed completely out of the conversation. When they reached the white house on the cliff, they almost seemed to have slipped into old casual relations. But the younger brother was well aware that this was not so. The change that had so amazed him was apparent to him at every turn. The overbearing mastery, to which he had been accustomed all his life, had turned in some miraculous fashion into something that was oddly like deference. It was fully evident that Eustace meant to keep his word and leave him in command. Dinah met them in the rose-twined portico. There was a deep flush in her cheeks. Her eyes were very bright, resolutely unafraid. She shook hands with Eustace, and he alone was aware of the tremor that ran through her whole being as she did so. "Isabel is asleep," she said. "She often gets asleep in the afternoon, and she is always the stronger for it when she wakes. Will you have some tea before you go to her?" They had tea in the sunny veranda overlooking the sea. Sir Eustace was very quiet and grave, and it was Scott who gently conversed with the girl, smoothing away all difficulties. She was plainly determined to conquer her nervousness, and she succeeded to a great extent before the ordeal was over. But there was obvious relief in her eyes when Sir Eustace set down his cup and rose to go. "I think I will go to her now," he said. "I shall not wake her." He went, and a great stillness fell behind him. Scott dropped into silence, and they sat together, he smoking, she leaning back in her chair idle, with wistful eyes upon the silvery sea. Up in Isabel's room overhead, there was neither sound nor movement, but presently there fell a soft footfall upon the stairs, and the nurse came quietly through and spoke to Dinah. "Mrs. Everard is asleep. Her brother is watching her, and Biddy is within call. I thought I would take a little walk on the shore, as I shall not be wanted just at present." "Oh, of course," Dinah said. "Don't hurry back." The nurse smiled and flitted away into the golden evening sunlight. Dinah turned her head towards her silent companion. "I wonder," she said, "if I could learn to be a nurse." He blew a cloud of smoke into the air. "Are you still worrying about the future?" he said. "I don't know that I'm exactly worrying," she made her low reply, "but I shall have to decide about it very soon." Scott was silent for a space while he finished his cigarette. Then at last, slowly, haltingly, he spoke. Dinah, I have been thinking about the future, too. If I touch upon anything that hurts you, you must stop me, and I will not say another word. But, child, it seems to me that we shall both be rather lost when Isabel is gone. I wonder, would it shock you very much if I suggested to you, as a solution of the difficulty, that we should some day in the future enter into partnership together? He spoke with obvious effort. His hands were gripped upon the arms of his chair. The wicker creaked in the strain of his grasp, but he himself remained lying back with eyes half closed in compulsory inaction. Dinah also sat absolutely still. If his words amazed her, she gave no sign. Only the wistfulness about her mouth deepened as she made answer below her breath. It is just like you to suggest such a thing, but it is quite impossible. He opened his eyes and looked at her very steadily and kindly. Quite, he said. She bent her head, swiftly lowering her own. Yes, thank you a million times. Quite. Even if I promise never to make love to you, he said, his voice half quizzical, half tender. She put out a trembling hand and laid it on his arm. Oh, Scott, it isn't that. He took the hand and held it. My dear, don't cry, he urged gently. I knew you wouldn't have me really. I only thought I would just place myself completely at your disposal in case, some day, you might be willing to give me the chance to serve you in any capacity whatever. There, it is over. We are as we were, friends. He smiled at her with the words, and after a moment stooped and lightly touched her fingers with his lips. Come, he said gently. I haven't frightened you away, have I? No, she whispered. His hand clasped hers for a second or two longer, then quietly let it go. Don't be distressed, he said. I will never do it again. I am now, and always, your trusty friend. And with that, he rose in his slow way, paused to light another cigarette, smiled again upon her, and softly went indoors. End of section 55. Section 56 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 26. The Last Summons. There is naught in life more solemn than the waiting hush that falls before the coming of the great change which men call death. And it is to the watchers, rather than to the passing soul itself, that the wonder seems to draw most close. To stand before the veil, to know that very soon it must be lifted for the loved one to pass beyond, to wait for the glimpse of that spirit world from which only the frail wall of mortality divides even the least spiritual, to watch, as it were, for the gate of death to open and the great revelation to flash for one blinding moment upon the dazzled eyes that may not grasp the meaning of what they see. This is to stand for a space within the very sanctuary of God. The awe of it and the wonder hung night and day over the little rose-covered house on the heath above the sea, where Isabel was breathing forth the last of her broken earthly life. Dinah moved in that strange atmosphere as one in a dream. She spent most of her time with Scott in a silent companionship in which no worldly thoughts seemed to have any part. The things of earth, all worry, all distress, were in abeyance, had sunk to such infinitesimal proportions
that she was scarcely aware of them at all. It was as though they had climbed the steep mountain with Isabel, and not till they turned again to descend could they be aware of those things which lay so far below. Without Scott, both doubts and fears would have been her portion, but with him, all terrors fell shadow-like away before her. She hardly realized all that his presence meant to her during those days of waiting, but she leaned upon him instinctively, as upon a sure support. He never failed her. Of Eustace she saw but little. From the very first, it was evident that his place was nearer to Isabel than Scott's had ever been. He did not shoulder Scott aside, but somehow, as a matter of course, he occupied the position that the younger brother had sought to fill for the past 7 years. It was natural. It was inevitable. Dinah could have resented this superseding at the outset had she not seen how gladly Scott gave place. Later, she realized that the ground on which they stood was too holy for such considerations to have any weight with either brother. They were united in the one supreme effort to make the way smooth for the sister who meant so much to them both. And during all those days of waiting, Dinah never heard a harsh or impatient word upon the elder's lips. All arrogance, all hardness, seemed to have fallen away from him as he trod with them that mountain path. Even old Biddy realized the change, and relented somewhat towards him, though she never wholly brought herself to look upon him as an ally. It was on a stormy evening at the beginning of July that Dinah was sitting alone in the little creeper-grown veranda, watching the wonderful greens and purples of the sea, when Eustace came, soft-footed through the window behind her, and sat down in a chair close by, which Scott had vacated a few moments before. Scott had just gone to the village post office with some letters, but she had refused to accompany him, for it was the hour when she usually sat with Isabel. She glanced at Eustace swiftly as he sat down, half expecting a message from the sick room. But he said nothing, merely leaning back in the wicker chair and fixing his eyes upon the somber splendor of endless waters upon which hers had been resting. There was a massive look about him, as of a strong man deliberately bent to some gigantic task. A little tremor went through her as furtively she watched him. His silence, unlike the silences of Scott, was disquieting. She could never feel wholly at ease in his presence. He turned his head towards her after a few seconds of absolute stillness, and in a moment her eyes sank. She sat in palpitating silence, as one caught in some disgraceful act. But still he did not speak, and the painful color flooded her face under his mute scrutiny, till in sheer distress she found herself forced to take the initiative. "Is Isabel expecting me?" she faltered. "Ought I to go?" "No," he said quietly. "She is dozing. Old Biddy is with her." It seemed as if the intolerable silence were about to fall again. She cast about desperately for a means of escape. "Biddy was up and down during the night. I think I will relieve her for a little while and let her rest." She would have risen with the words, but unexpectedly he reached forth a detaining hand. "Do you mind waiting a minute?" he said. "I will not say or do anything to frighten you." He spoke with a faint smile that somehow hurt her almost unbearably. She remained as she was, leaning forward in her chair. "I am not afraid," she murmured almost inaudibly. His hand seemed to plead for hers, and in a moment she laid her own within it. "That's right," he said. "Dinah, will you try and treat me as if I were a friend, just for a few minutes?" The tone of his voice, like his smile, pierced her with a poignancy that sent the quick tears to her eyes. She forced them back with all her strength. "I would like to, always,"
she whispered. "Thank you," he said. "You are kinder than I deserve. I've done nothing to win your confidence, so it's all the more generous of you to bestow it. On the strength of your generosity, I'm going to ask you a question which only a friend could ask. Dinah, is there any understanding of any sort, apart from friendship, between you and Scott?" She started slightly at the question, and in a moment, firmly, with a certain authority, his hand closed upon hers. "You needn't be afraid to speak on Scott's account," he said, with that rather grim humility that seemed so foreign to his proud nature that every sign of it stabbed her afresh. "I'm not such a dog in the manger as that, and he knows it." "Oh, no," Dinah said, and her words came with a rush. "But I told you before, didn't I? He doesn't care for me like that. He never has, never will." "I wonder why you say that," Eustace said. "Because it is true." With a species of feverish insistence, she answered him. "How could I help knowing? Of course I know. Oh, please don't let us talk about it. It hurts me." "I want you to bear with me," he said gently. "Just for a few minutes. Dinah, what if you are making a mistake? Mistakes happen, you know. Scott is a shy sort of chap, and immensely reserved. Doesn't it occur to you that he may care for you, and yet be afraid, just as you are afraid, to let you know?" "No," Dinah said. "He doesn't. I know he doesn't." She spoke with her eyes upon the ground, her voice sunk very low. She felt as if she were being drawn down from the heights she desired to tread. She did not want to contemplate the problems that she knew very surely awaited her upon the lower level. She did not want to quit her sanctuary before the time. Sir Eustace received her assurance in silence, but he kept her hand in his, and the power of his personality seemed to penetrate to the very center of her being. He spoke at last, almost under his breath, still closely watching her downcast face. "Are you quite sure you still care for him in that way?" She made a quick appealing gesture. "Oh, need I answer that? I feel so ashamed." "No, you needn't answer," he made steady reply. "But you've nothing to be ashamed about. Stumpy's an awful ass, you know. Always has been. He's been head over heels in love with you ever since he met you. No, you needn't let that shock you. He's such a bashful knight he'll never tell you so. You'll have to do that part of it." He smiled with faint irony. "But you may take my word for it, it is so. He has thought of nothing but you and your happiness from the very beginning of things. And, unlike someone else we know, he has had the decency always to put your happiness first." He paused. Dinah's eyes had flashed up to his, green, eager, intensely alive, and behind those eyes her soul seemed to be straining like a thing in leash. "Oh, I knew he had cared for someone," she breathed, "but it couldn't have been me." "Yes," Sir Eustace said slowly, "you and none other. You wonder if it's true, how I know? He's an awful ass, as I said before, one of the few supreme fools who never think of themselves. I knew that he was caught all right, ages back in Switzerland. And, being a low hound of mean instincts, I set to work to cut him out." "Oh," murmured Dinah. "That was just what I did with Rose Devine." His mouth twisted a little. "It's a funny world, Dinah," he said. "Our little game has cost us both something. I got too near the candle myself, and the scorch was pretty sharp while it lasted. Well, to get back to my story, Scott saw that I was beginning to give you indigestion, and, being, as I mentioned before, several sorts of a fool, he tackled me upon the subject and swore that if I didn't put an end to the game, he would put you on your guard against me, tell you, in fact, the precise species of rotter that I chanced to be. I was naturally annoyed by his interference. Anyone would have been. I gave him the kicking he deserved. That was low of me, wasn't it?" As she made a quick movement of shrinking. "You won't forgive me for that, or for what came after. The very next day, to spite the little beast, I proposed to you."
Dinah's eyes were fiercely bright. "I wish I'd known," she said.
"I wish to heaven you had, my dear." Eustace spoke with a grim hint of humor. "It would have saved us both a good deal of unnecessary trouble and humiliation. However, Scott was too big a fool to tell you. There's a martyr-like sort of cussedness about him that is several degrees worse than any pride. So he let things be, still cheating himself into the belief that the arrangement was for your happiness, till, as you are aware, it turned out so manifestly otherwise that he found himself obliged once more to come to the rescue of his lady love. But his exasperating humility was such that he never suspected the real reason for your change of mind, and when I accused him of cutting me out, he was as scandalized as only a righteous man knows how to be. You can't do much with a fellow like that, you know, a fool who won't believe the evidence of his own senses. Besides, it was not for me to enlighten him, particularly as you didn't want him to know the real state of things just then. So I left him alone. The next day, only the next day, mind you, the silent night opened his heart. To whom, do you think? You'll be horribly furious when I tell you." He looked into the hot eyes with an expression half tender in his own.
"Tell me," breathed Dinah.
"Really? Well, prepare for a nasty shock. To Rose Devine."
"To Rose?" Indignation gave place to bewilderment in Dinah's eyes.
"Even so, to Rose. She guessed the truth, and he frankly admitted she was right, but gave her to understand that, as he hadn't a chance in the world, you were never to know. I'm telling you the truth, Dinah. You needn't look so incredulous. She naturally considered that he was not treating you very fairly, and said so. But," he raised his shoulders slightly, "you know Scott. Mules can't compete with him when he has his mind made up to a thing. He gracefully put an end to the discussion, and doubtless he has buried the whole subject in a neat little corner of his heart, where no one can ever tumble over it, and resigned himself to a lonely old age. Now, Dinah, I'm going to give you the soundest piece of advice I've ever given anyone. If you are wise, you will dig it up before the moss grows, bring it into the air, and call it back to life. It is the greatest desire of Isabel's heart to see you two happy together. She told me so only today, and I'm beginning to think that I wish it too."
His look was wholly kind as he uttered the last words. He held her hand in the close grip of a friend.
"Don't let that insane humility of his be his ruin," he urged. "He's a fool. I've always said so. But his foolishness is the sort that attacks only the great. Once let him know you care, and he'll be falling over himself to propose."
"Oh, don't," Dinah begged, and her voice sounded chill yet somehow piteous. "I couldn't ever marry him. I told him so only the other day."
"What? He proposed, did he?" Sheer amazement sounded in Eustace's voice. Dinah was not looking at him any longer. She sat rather huddled in her chair, as if a cold wind had caught her.
"Yes," she said in the same small, uneven voice. "He proposed. He didn't make love to me. In fact, he promised that he never would. But he thought— yes, that was it. He thought that presently I should be lonely, and he wanted me to know that he was willing to protect me."
"What a fool," Eustace said. "And so you refused him. I don't wonder. I should have pitched something at him if I'd been you."
"Oh, no, that wasn't why I refused. I had another reason."
Dinah's head was bent low. He saw the hot color she sought to hide.
"I didn't know he cared," she whispered. "But even if I had known, I couldn't have said yes. I can never say yes now."
"Good heavens above," he said. "Why not?"
"It is a reason I can't tell anyone," faltered Dinah.
"Nonsense," he said, with a quick touch of his old imperiousness. "You can tell me." She shook her head.
"No, not you, not anyone."
"That is absurd," he said with brief decision. "What is the reason? Out with it. Quick, like a good child. If you could marry me, you could marry him."
"But I couldn't have married you," she protested, "if I had known."
"It's something that's cropped up lately, is it?" He bent towards her, watching her keenly. "It can't be so very terrible."
"It is," she told him in distress. He was silent a moment. Then very suddenly he moved, put his arm around her, drew her close.
"What is it, my elf? Tell me," he whispered.
She hid her face against him with a little sob. It was odd, but at that moment she felt no fear of the man. He, whose fiery caresses had once appalled her, had, by some means unknown, possessed himself of her confidence, so that she could not keep him at a distance. She did not even wish to do so. After a few seconds, quiveringly, she began to speak. "I don't know how to tell you. It's an awful thing to tell. You know, I've never been happy at home. My mother never liked me, was often cruel to me." She shuddered suddenly and violently. "I never knew why, till that awful night, the last time I saw her. And then she told me." She drew a little closer to him like a frightened child. He held her against his breast. She was trembling all over.
"Well?" he said gently.
Desperately, she forced herself to continue. "I don't belong to my father at all. Only to her."
"What?" he said.
She buried her shamed face a little deeper. "That was why she married," she whispered.
"Your mother herself told you that?" Sir Eustace's voice was very low, but there was in it a danger note that made her quail.
Someone was coming along the garden path, but neither of them heard. Dinah was crying with piteous, long-drawn sobs. The telling of that tragic secret had wrung her very soul. "Oh, don't be angry. You won't be angry," she pleaded brokenly. His hand was on her head.
"My child, I'm not angry with you," he said. "You were not to blame. There, dear, there, don't cry. Isabel will be distressed if she finds out. We mustn't let her know of this."
"Or Scott either." She lifted her face appealingly. "Eustace, please, please, you won't tell Scott. I couldn't bear him to know." He looked into her beseeching eyes, and his own softened.
"It may be he will have to know some day," he said, "but not yet."
The halting steps drew nearer, uneven, yet somehow purposeful. Abruptly, Eustace became aware of them. He looked up sharply.
"You had better go, dear,"
he whispered to the girl in his arms.
"Isabel may be wanting you at any time. We must think of her first now. Run in quickly and dry your eyes before anyone sees. Come along."
He rose, supporting her, turned her towards the window, and gently but urgently pushed her within. She went swiftly enough as he released her, went with her hands over her face and not a backwards glance. And Eustace wheeled back with a movement that was almost fierce, and met his brother as he set foot upon the veranda. Scott's face was pale as death, and there was that in his eyes that could not be ignored. Eustace answered it on the instant, briefly, with a restraint that obviously cost him an effort.
"It's all right. Dinah is a bit upset this evening, but she'll be all right directly if we leave her alone."
Scott did not so much as pause.
"Let me pass,"
he said. His voice was perfectly quiet, but the command of it was such that Eustace, taken unawares, gave ground as it were instinctively. But the next moment, impulsively, he caught Scott's arm.
"I say, Stumpy." An odd embarrassment possessed him. He shook it off half angrily. "You needn't go making mistakes, jumping to idiotic conclusions. I'm not cutting you out this time."
Scott looked at him. His light eyes held contempt.
"Oh, I know that,"
he said, and there was in his slow voice a note of bitter humor that cut like a whip.
"You are never in earnest. You were always the sort to make sport for yourself out of suffering, and then to toss the dregs of your amusement to those who are not sportsmen."
Eustace was as white as he was himself. He held him in a grip of iron.
"What the devil do you mean?"
he said, his voice husky with the strong effort he made to control it. The younger brother was absolutely controlled, but his eyes shone like a dazzling white flame.
"Ask yourself that question,"
he said, and his words, though low, had a burning quality, almost as if some force apart from the man himself inspired them.
"You know the answer as well as I do. You've studied the damnable game so long, offered so many victims upon the altar of your accursed sport. There's nothing to prevent your going on with it. You will go on, no doubt, till you tire of the chase. And then your turn will come. You will find yourself alone among the ruins, and you will pay the price. You may repent then, but repentance sometimes comes too late."
He was gone with the words, gone as if an inner force compelled, shaking off the hand that had detained him, and passing scatheless within. He went up the stairs as calmly as if he had entered the house without interruption. Someone was sobbing piteously behind a closed door, but he did not turn in that direction. He moved straight to the door of Isabel's room, as if a voice had called him. And on the threshold Biddy met him, her black eyes darkly mysterious, her wrinkled face drawn with awe rather than grief.
"Ah, Master Scott, and it is yourself," she whispered. "I was coming to fetch you, coming to tell you. It is the call. She's had her last summons. Fate and I almost heard it myself. She'll be gone by morning, the blessed lamb. There'll be no holding her after this."
Scott passed her by without a word. He went straight to his sister's bedside. She was lying with her face turned up to the evening sky, but on the instant her eyes met his, and in them was that look of a great expectation which many term the shadow of death.
"Oh, Stumpy, is it you?"
she said. Her breathing was quick and irregular, but it did not seem to hurt her.
"I've had such a wonderful dream. Or could it have been a vision?"
He bent and took her hand in his. His eyes were infinitely tender. All the passion had been wiped out of his face.
"It may have been a vision, dear," he said.
Her look brightened. She smiled.
"He was here, in this room, with me," she said. "He was standing there at the foot of the bed, and I held out my arms to him. Oh, Stumpy, I almost thought I was going with him then, but I think he heard you coming, for he laughed and drew back. 'We shall meet in the morning,' he said. And while I was still looking, he was gone."
She began to pant. He stooped and raised her. She clung to him with all her waning strength.
Stumpy, you will help me through the night?" "My darling, yes," he said.
She clung to him still.
"It won't be goodbye," she urged softly. "You will be coming too, very soon."
"God grant it," he said under his breath. Her look dwelt upon him. Again, faintly, she smiled.
"Ah, Stumpy," she said, "but you are going to be very happy first, my dear. My dear."
End of section 56. Section 57 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 27. The Mountaintop. That night fell like a black veil, starless and still. Up in Isabel's room, the watchers came and went, dividing the hours. Only the nurse and old Biddy remained always at their posts, the one seated near one of the wide-flung windows, the other crouched on an ottoman at the foot of the bed, her beady eyes perpetually fixed upon the white, motionless face upon the pillow. Only by the irregular and sometimes difficult breathing did they know that Isabel still lived, for she gave no sign of consciousness, uttered no word, made no voluntary movement of any sort. Like those who watched about her, she seemed to be waiting for the amazing revelation of the dawn. They had propped her high with pillows. Her pale hands lay outside the coverlet. Her eyes were closed. She did not seem to notice who came or went. "She may slip away without waking," the nurse whispered once to Dinah, who had crept to her side. "Or she may be conscious just at the last. There's no telling." Dinah did not think that she was asleep, but yet during all her vigil, the white lids had not stirred. No spark of vitality had touched the marble face. She was possessed by a great longing to speak to her, to call her out of that trance-like silence, but she did not dare. She was as one bound by a spell. The great stillness was too holy to break. All her own troubles were sunk in oblivion. She felt as if she moved in a shadow world, where no troubles could penetrate, where no voice was ever lifted above a whisper. As she crept from the room, she met Eustace entering. He looked gaunt and haggard in the dim light. Nothing seemed natural on that night of waiting. He paused a moment, touched her shoulder. "Go and rest, child," he muttered. "I will call you if she wakes." She sent him a faint smile and flitted by him into the passage. How could she rest on a night like this, with the vague whisperings of the spirit world all about her? Besides, in another hour the darkness would be over. The dawn would come. Not for all the world would she miss that wonderful coming of a new day, the day which Isabel was awaiting in that dumb passivity of unquestioning patience. They had come so far up the mountain track together that she must be with her when the morning found them on the summit. But it was Eustace's turn to watch, and she moved towards her own room, through the open windows of which the vague murmur and splash of the sleeping sea drifted like the accompaniment of far-off music, undreamed-of alleluias. The dim glow of a lamp lay across her path like a barrier staying her feet. Almost involuntarily she paused before a half-open door. It was as though some unseen force compelled her, and, so pausing, there came to her a sound that gripped her like a hand upon her heart. It was the broken whispering of a man in an agony of prayer. It was not by her own desire that she stood to listen. The anguish of that voice held her, so that she was powerless to move. "Oh God, oh God!" The words pierced her with their entreaty. It was a cry from the very depths. "The mistake was mine. Let me bear the consequence, but save her. Oh, save her from further suffering." A momentary silence, and then, more desperately still, "Oh God, if thou art anywhere, hear and help. Let me bear whatever thou wilt, but spare her. Spare her, she has borne so much." A terrible sob choked the gasping utterance. There fell a silence so tense, so poignant with pain, that the girl upon the threshold trembled as one physically afraid. Yet she could not turn and flee. She felt as if it were laid upon her to stand and witness this awful struggle of a soul in torment. But that it should be Scott, the wise, the confident, the unafraid, passing alone through this place of desolation, sent the blood to her heart in a great wave of consternation. If Scott failed, if the sword of Greatheart were broken, it seemed to her that nothing could be left in all the world, as if even the coming dawn must be buried in darkness. Was it for Isabel he was praying thus? She supposed it must be, though she had felt all through this night of waiting that no prayer was needed. Isabel was so near the mountain-top that surely she was safe, nearer already to God than any of their prayers could bring her. And yet, Scott was wrestling here as one overwhelmed with evil. Wherefore? Wherefore? The steady faith of this good friend of hers had never, to her knowledge, flickered before. What had happened to shake him thus? He was praying again, more coherently, but in words so low that they were scarcely audible. She crept a little nearer, and now she could see him, kneeling at the table, his head sunk upon it, his arms flung wide with clenched fists that seemed impotently to beat the air. "I'm praying all wrong," he whispered, "but forgive me. I'm in all the dark tonight. Thou knowest, Lord, how awful the dark can be. I'm not asking for answer. Only guide our feet. Deliver us from evil. Deliver her, O God. Deliver my Dinah, by that love which is of thee, and which nothing will ever alter. If I may not help her, give me strength to stand aside." A great shiver went through him. He gripped his hands together suddenly and passionately. "Oh, my God," he groaned, "it is the hardest thing on earth, to stand and do nothing, when I love her so." Something seemed to give way within him with the words. His shoulders shook convulsively. He buried his face in his arms. And in that moment, the power that had stayed Dinah upon the threshold suddenly urged her forward. Almost before she realized it, she was there at his side, stooping over him, holding him fast in a clasp that was free from any hesitation or fear, a clasp in which all her pulsing womanhood rushed forth to him, exulting, glorying in its self-betrayal. "My dear, oh my dear," she said, "are you praying for me?" "Dinah," he said. Just her name, no more, but spoken in a tone that thrilled her through and through. He leaned against her for a few moments, almost as if he feared to move. Then, as one gathering strength, he uttered a great sigh and slowly got to his feet. "You mustn't bother about me," he said, and the sudden rapture had all gone out of his voice. It had the flatness of utter weariness. "I shall be all right." But Dinah's hands yet clung to his shoulders. Those moments of yielding had revealed to her more than any subsequent word or action could belie. Her eyes, shining with a great light, looked straight into his. "Dear Scott, dear Greatheart," she said, and her voice trembled over the tender utterance of the name. "Are you in trouble? Can't I help?" He took her face between his hands, looking straight back into the shining eyes. "You are the trouble, Dinah," he told her simply, "and I'd give all I have, I'd give my soul to make life easier for you." She leaned towards him, and suddenly those shining eyes were blurred with a glimmer of tears. "Life is dreadfully difficult," she said, "but you have never done anything but help me. And, oh, Scott, I don't know if I ought to tell you. Forgive me if it's wrong, but I feel I must. Her breath came so quickly that she could hardly utter the words. I love you better than anyone else in the world. Dinah, he said as one incredulous. It is true, she panted. It is true. Eustace knows it, has known it almost as long as I have. It isn't the only thing I have to tell you, but it's the first and the biggest. And even though I shall never be anything more to you than I am now, I'm glad, I'm proud for you to know. There's nothing else that counts in the same way. And though I refused you the other day, I wanted you dreadfully, dreadfully. If I had only been good enough for you, but I'm not. She broke off, battling with herself. He was still holding her face between his hands, and there was something of insistence, something that even bordered upon ruthlessness in his hold. Though the tears were running down her face, he would not let her go. Will you tell me what you mean by that? He said, his voice very low. Or must I ask Eustace? She started. There was that in his tone that made her wince inexplicably. Oh, no, she said. No, I'll tell you myself, if you must know. I'm afraid I must, he said, and for all their resolution, the words had a sound of deadly weariness. He let her go slowly as he uttered them. Sit down, he said gently, and please don't tremble. There's nothing to make you afraid. She dropped into the chair he indicated and made a desperate effort to calm herself. He stood beside her with the absolute patience of one accustomed to long waiting. After a few moments, she put up a quivering hand, seeking his. He took it instantly, and as his fingers closed firmly upon her own, she found courage. I didn't want you to know, she whispered, but I see now. It's better that you should. There's no other way of making you understand. It's just this. She swallowed hard, striving to control the piteous trembling of her voice. I am one of those people that never ought to have been born. I don't belong anywhere except to my mother who has no use for me, hated me before I ever came into the world. You see, she married because another man, my real father, had played her false. Oh, do you wonder? She bowed her forehead upon his hand with a rush of tears. That when I knew, I felt as if I couldn't go on with life. Her weeping was piteous. It shook her from head to foot. But in the very midst of her distress, there came to her a wonder so great that it checked her tears at the height of their flow. For very suddenly it dawned upon her that Scott, her knight of the golden armor, was kneeling at her feet. Half in wonder and half in awe, she lifted her head and looked at him. And in that moment he took her two hands and kissed them, tenderly, reverently, lingeringly. Was this what you and Eustace were talking about this afternoon? He said. She nodded. I had to tell him why I couldn't marry you. He had been so kind. But my own Dinah, he said, and in his voice was a quiver half quizzical, yet strangely charged with emotion. Did you ever seriously imagine that I should allow a sordid little detail like that to come between us? Surely Eustace knew better than that. She heard him in amazement, scarcely believing that she heard. Can you mean, she faltered, that it really doesn't count? I mean that it is less than nothing to me, he made answer, and in his eyes, as they looked into hers, was that glory of worship that she had once seen in a dream. I mean, my darling,
that since you want me, as I want you, nothing in the world can ever come between us any more. Oh, my dear, I wish you'd told me sooner." "I knew I ought to," she murmured, still hardly believing. "And yet, somehow, I couldn't bear the thought of your knowing, particularly till Eustace told me. I never dreamed you cared. You are so great. You ought to have someone so much better than I. I'm not nearly good enough, not nearly." He was drawing her to him, and she went with a little sob into his arms, but she turned her face away over his shoulder, avoiding his. "I ought not to have told you I loved you," she said brokenly. "It wasn't right of me. Only, when I saw you so unhappy, I couldn't somehow keep it in any longer. Dear Scott, don't you think, before we go any further, you had better forget it and give me up?" "No, I don't think so." Scott spoke very softly, with the utmost tenderness into her ear. "Don't you realize," he said, "that we belong to each other? Could there possibly be anyone else for either you or me?" She did not answer him, only she clung a little closer, and, after a moment, as she felt the drawing of his hold, "Don't kiss me yet," she begged him tremulously. "Let us wait till the morning." His arms relaxed. "It is very near the morning now," he said. "Shall we go and watch for it?" They rose together. Dinah's eyes sought his for one shy, fleeting second, falling instantly, as if half dazzled, half afraid. He took her hand and led her quietly from the room. It was no longer dark in the passage outside. A pearly light was growing. The splash of the sea sounded very far below them, as the dim surging of a world unseen might rise to the watchers on the mountaintop. They moved to an open window at the end of the passage. No sound came from Isabel's room close by, and, after a few seconds, Scott turned noiselessly aside and entered. Dinah remained at the open window, waiting with a throbbing heart in the great silence that wrapped the world. She was not afraid, but she longed for Scott to come back. She was conscious of an urgent need of him. Several moments passed, and then softly he returned. "No change," he whispered. "Eustace will call us when it comes." She slipped her hand back into his without speaking. He made her sit upon the window seat and knelt himself upon it, his arm about her shoulders, his fingers clasping hers. She could see his face but vaguely in the dimness, but many times during that holy hour before the dawn, though he spoke no word, she felt that he was praying or giving thanks. Slowly, the twilight turned into a velvet dusk. The great change was drawing near. The silence lay like a thinning veil of mist upon the mountaintop. The clouds were parting in the east, all tinged with gold, like burnished gates flung back for the royal coming of the sun god. The stillness that lay upon all the waiting earth was sacred as the hush of prayer. Their faces were turned towards the spreading glow. It shone upon them as it shone upon all beside, widening, intensifying, till the whole earth lay wrapped in solemn splendor. And then, at last, through the open gates, red, royal, triumphant, the sun god came. There came a moment in which all things were touched with the glory, all things were made new. And in that moment, sudden as a flash of light, a bird of pure white plumage appeared before their eyes, hovered an instant, then flew,
mounting on wide, gleaming wings straight into the dawn. Even while they watched, it vanished through the gates of gold, and only the gracious sunshine of a new day remained. A low voice spoke from the chamber of death. They turned from the vision and saw Eustace standing in the doorway. He was very white, but absolutely calm. There was a nobility about him at that moment that sent a queer little throb to Dinah's heart. He held out his hand, not to her, but to Scott. "She is gone," he said. Scott went to him. She saw their hands meet. There was no agitation about either of them. "In her sleep," Scott said. "Yes, we didn't even know till it was over." They turned into the room, still hand grasping hand. And Dinah knelt up and stretched out her arms to the shining morning sky. Something within her was whispering that she and Scott had seen more of the passing of Isabel than any of those who had watched beside her bed. And in the quiet of that wonderful morning, she offered her quivering thanks to God. End of section 57. Section 58 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 28. Consolation. Of the long hours that followed that wonderful dawning, Dinah never had any very distinct recollection. Even Scott seemed to forget her for a while, and it was old Biddy who presently found her curled up on the window seat, with her head upon the sill, asleep. Biddy, with her eyes very bright and alert, albeit deeply rimmed with red. She came to the childish, drooping figure, murmuring tender words. She put wiry arms about her and lifted her to her feet. "There, come to your own room and rest, my lamb," she said. "Old Biddy'll take care of ye, Aroon." Dinah submitted with the vague docility of a brain but half awakened. To be cared for and petted by Biddy was no new thing in her experience. She even felt as if the old crystal alpine days had returned, as Biddy undressed her and presently tucked her into bed. Later, still in semi-consciousness, she drank the hot milk that the old woman brought her, and then sank into a deep, deep sleep. She awakened from that sleep with a sense of well-being such as she had never known before, a feeling of complete security and rest. The house was very quiet, and through the curtained window there came to her the soft, slumberous splash of the waves. She lay very still, listening to the soothing murmur, gradually focusing her mind again after its long oblivion. The memory of the previous night and of the coming of the dawn came back to her, and with it the thought of Isabel, but without grief and without regret. They had left her on the mountaintop, and she knew that all must be well. A great peace seemed to have fallen like a veil upon the whole house. Surely no one could be mourning over that glad release. She saw again the flashing of those free wings in the dawnlight, and her heart thrilled afresh. She remembered, too, the close, strong clasp of Scott's hand as he had watched with her. Where was Scott now? The wonder darted suddenly through her brain, and with it, swift as a flying cloud shadow, came the want of him, the longing for the quiet voice, the quivering delight of his near presence. She half raised herself, and then, caught by another thought, sank down again to hide her burning face in the pillow. It would be a little difficult to meet him again. On the old easy terms of friendship it could not be, and they had hardly begun to be lovers yet, he had not even kissed her. Another thought came to her, of an even more disturbing nature. Save for old Biddy and the nurse, she was alone with the two brothers now. Would they insist upon sending her home until Scott was ready to come and take her away? Oh, surely Scott would never ask that of her. Nevertheless, the thought tormented her. She did not see any way out of the difficulty, and she was terribly afraid that Scott would be equally at a loss. "I don't think I could bear it," she whispered to herself. "And yet, if he says so, I suppose I must. I couldn't refuse if he said so." The soft opening of the door recalled her to the immediate present. She saw old Biddy's face with its watchful guardian look peep stealthily in upon her. "Ah, mavourneen," she whispered fondly, coming forward. "And is it awake ye are? I've peeped round at you this 5 times, and you were sleeping like a newborn babe. Lie still, darlint, while I fetch you a cup of tea, then." She was gone with the words, but in a very little she was back again, with her own especial brew. She set her tray down by Dinah's side, but Dinah did not even look at it. She raised herself instead, and threw warm arms round the old woman's neck. "Oh, Biddy," she said, "Biddy, darling, I can't think what I'd ever do without you." Biddy uttered a sharp sob and gathered her close. But in a moment, half angrily, "And what is it that I'd be crying for at all?" she said. "Isn't my dear Isabel safer with the Almighty than she ever was with me? Isn't she gone to the blessed saints in paradise? And would I have her back? No, I'm not that selfish, Miss Dinah. I'm an old woman, moreover, and be the same token me own time can't be so far off now." But Dinah clung faster to her. "Please, Biddy, please, don't talk like that. I want you," she said. "Ah, bless the dear lamb," said Biddy, and tenderly kissed the upturned pleading face. "Miss Isabel said you would now. But when you've got Master Scott to take care of you, it's not old Biddy that she'll be wanting any longer." "I shall," Dinah vowed. "I shall always want my Biddy." "And may the Lord Almighty bless you for the word," said Biddy. When Dinah was dressed, a great shyness fell upon her, born partly of the still mystery of the presence of death that wrapped the little house. She stood by the window of her room, looking forth, irresolute, over the evening sea. The blinds were drawn only in the room of death, for Scott had so decreed, and the air blew in, sweet and fresh from the rippling water. After a few minutes, Biddy came softly up behind her. "And is it himself you're looking for, mavourneen?" she murmured at Dinah's shoulder. Dinah started a little and flushed. She wondered if Biddy knew all or only guessed. "I don't know what to do," she said rather confusedly. Biddy gave her a quick, wise look. "Will I tell you a secret, Miss Dinah, dear?" she whispered. Dinah looked at her. The old woman's face was full of shrewd understanding. "Yes, tell me," she said somewhat breathlessly. Biddy's brown hand grasped her arm. "Master Scott went to town this morning," she said. "He'll be back any minute now. Sir Eustace is downstairs. He wants to see you, to tell you something before Master Scott gets back." "Oh, what?" gasped Dinah. "There now, there, don't you be afraid," said Biddy, her beady eyes softening. "It's something you'll like. Master Scott, he's not the gentleman to make you do anything you don't want to do. Don't you trust him, Miss Dinah?" Of course," Dinah said with trembling lips. "Then you've nothing to be afraid of," said Biddy wisely. "Faith, it's only the marriage license he's been to fetch." "Oh, Biddy!" Dinah wheeled from the window with both her hands over her heart. Biddy nodded with grave triumph. "It was Sir Eustace made him go. Master Scott, he didn't think it would be decent, not at first. But, as Sir Eustace said,
There's more ways than one of being undecent. And after all, it was the dearest wish of Miss Isabel's heart. Don't you be a conventional fool, he said. And for once, I agreed with him, said Biddy naively, though I think he needn't have used bad language over it. Oh, Biddy, Dinah said again. Then, very oddly, she began to smile, and the tension went out of her attitude. She kissed the wrinkled cheek and turned. I think perhaps I will go down and speak to Sir Eustace, she said. She went quickly, aware that if she suffered herself to pause, the overpowering shyness would seize upon her again. Guided by the scent of cigarette smoke, she entered the dining room. Sir Eustace was seated at a writing table near the window. He looked up swiftly at her entrance. "Awake at last," he said, and would have risen with the words, but she reached him first and checked him. "Eustace, oh, Eustace," she said, Biddy has just told me." He frowned as she stopped in confusion, steadying herself rather piteously against his shoulder. But in a moment, seeing her agitation, he put a kindly arm around her. "Biddy is an old fool, always was. Don't take any notice of her. What a ferment you're in, child. What's the matter? There, sit down." He drew her down onto the arm of his chair, and she leaned against him, striving for self-control. You are so much too good," she murmured. He smiled rather grimly. "No one ever accused me of that before. Was that the staggering piece of information that Biddy has imparted to you?" "No," she said, a fleeting smile upon her own face. It was about Scott. It took my breath away, that's all." "That all?" said Eustace with a faintly wry lift of one eyebrow. She slipped a shy arm around his neck. "Eustace, do you think I ought to let Scott marry me?" "I'm quite sure you'll break his heart if you don't," responded Eustace. "Oh, I couldn't do that," she said quickly. "No, I shouldn't if I were you. It isn't a very amusing game for anyone concerned." Sir Eustace took up his pen with his free hand. "He's rather a good chap, you know," he said. "Beastly good sometimes. He'll take a little living up to, but you'll manage that, I dare say. When he told me how things stood between you, I saw directly there was only one thing to be done, and I made him do it. The idea is to get you married before the nurse goes, and she is off tomorrow." He paused, looking at her critically, and again, half cynically, half sadly, smiled. "You took that well?" he said. "If it had been to me, you'd have jumped sky high. You're a wise little creature, Dinah. You've chosen the best man, and you'll never be sorry. I congratulate you on your choice." He turned his face fully to her, and she stooped swiftly and kissed him. "I'm dreadfully sorry I treated you so badly first," she whispered. "You needn't be," he said. "It did me good. You showed me myself from a point of view that I had never taken before. You taught me to be human. I told Isabel so. She, poor girl." He stopped a second, and she saw that momentarily he was moved. But he continued almost at once. "She was grateful to you, too," he said. "You removed the outer crust at a single stroke, just in time to prevent atrophy. Of course," he glanced down at the letter under his hand. "It was a more or less painful process, but it may comfort you to know that it didn't go quite so deep with me as I thought it had at the time. There's no sense crying over spilt milk anyhow. I never was that sort of ass. You may, or may not, be pleased to hear that I am already well on the way to Consolation." He lifted his eyes suddenly, with an expression in them that completely baffled her. It was almost as if he had detached himself for the moment from all participation in his own doings, contemplating them with a half-pathetic irony. "Shall I tell you what I was doing when you came in just now?" he said. I was writing to the girl you nearly sacrificed your happiness to cut out."
"Rose Devine?" she said quickly.
He nodded. "Yes, Rose Devine." He paused for a second, just a second. Then, "The girl I'm going to marry," he said quietly.
"Oh, Eustace!"
There was no mistaking the gladness in Dinah's tone. "I am pleased," she said earnestly. "I know you will be happy together. You are simply made for each other." He smiled, still in that strange, half-rueful fashion. "I'm doing the best I can under the circumstances. It is kind of you to be pleased. But now, once more to your affairs. They are more pressing than mine just now. It may interest you to know that Scott, although under Isabel's will he is made absolutely independent of me, is willing to live at the Dower House if that arrangement meets with your approval."
"Of course. I shall love it," Dinah said.
"I'm glad of that, for it will be a great help to me to have him there. You will be able to have Billy to stay with you in the holidays and roam about as you like. Scott is making all sorts of plans. I'm going to settle the place on him as a wedding present."
"Oh, Eustace, how kind! What a lovely gift!"
Sir Eustace smiled at her. "I'm giving him more than that, Dinah. I'm giving him his wife and the wedding ring." The irony was uppermost again, but it held no sting. "It will fit no other hand but yours, and it will serve to keep you in constant remembrance of your good luck. I can hear him coming up the path. Aren't you going to meet him?" She sprang up like a startled fawn.
"Oh, I can't meet him yet," she said desperately.
There was a curious glint in Eustace's eyes as he watched her, a flash of mockery that came and went. "What?" he said. "Do you want me to help you to run away from him now?" She looked at him quickly, and in a moment her hesitation was gone.
"Oh, no," she said.
"No." And with a little breathless sound that might have been a tremor of laughter, she fled away from him out into the evening sunshine to meet her lover. End of section 58.
Section 59 of Greatheart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell. Chapter 29. The Seventh Heaven. They were married in the early morning at the little old church that had nestled for centuries among its trees in the village on the cliff. The absolute simplicity of the service deprived it of all terrors for Dinah. Standing with Scott in the glow of sunlight that smote full upon them through the mellow east window, she could not feel afraid. The whole world was so bright, so full of joy. "Do you think Isabel can see us now?" she whispered to him as they rose together from kneeling before the altar. He did not answer her in words, but his pale eyes were shining with that steadfast light of the spirit which she had come to know. She wished she could have knelt there by his side a little longer. They seemed to be so near to the gates of heaven. But they were not alone, and they could not linger. Sir Eustace, who had given her away, Biddy, who had tenderly supported her, the nurse who carried the fragrant bouquet of honeysuckle, the bond of love, which she had herself gathered for the bride, were all waiting to draw them back to earth again. And with Scott's hand clasping hers, she turned regretfully and left the holy place. Later, when Sir Eustace kissed her with the careless observation that he always kissed a bride, she had a moment of burning shyness, and she would gladly have hidden her face. But Scott did not kiss her. He had not offered to do so since that wonderful moment when he had first held her against his heart. He had not attempted to make love to her, and she had not felt the need of it. Grave and practical, he had laid his plans before her, and with the supreme confidence that he had always inspired in her, she had acquiesced to all. At his desire she had refrained from entering Isabel's death chamber. At his desire she was to leave that day for the dower house that was to be their home. Biddy would accompany her thither. The place was ready for occupation, for by Isabel's wish the work had gone on, though both she and Scott had known that they would never share a home there. It almost seemed as if she had foreseen the fulfillment of her earnest wish, and here Dinah was to await her husband. "I won't come to you till the funeral is over," he said to her. "I must be with Eustace. You won't be unhappy." No, she would not be unhappy. She had never been so near to death before, but she was neither frightened nor dismayed. She stood in the shadow indeed, but she looked forth from it over a world of such sunshine as filled her heart with quivering gladness. He did not want her to attend the funeral at Willowmount, would not, if he could help it, suffer her so much as to see the trappings of woe, and in this Dinah acquiesced also, comprehending fully the motive that underlay his wish. She knew that the earthly formalities, though they had to be faced, were to Scott something of the nature of a grim farce in which, while he could not escape it himself, he was determined that she should take no part. He was not mourning for Isabel. He would not pretend to mourn. Her death was to him but as the opening wide of a prison door to one who had long lain captive, pining for liberty. He would follow the poor worn body to its grave rather with thanksgiving than with grief. And realizing so well that this was his inevitable feeling, even as in a smaller degree it had become her own, Dinah agreed without demur to his wish to spare her all the jarring details, the travesty of mourning, that could not fail to strike a false chord in her soul. It was well for her that she had Biddy to think of. The old woman was pathetically eager to serve her. She had, in fact, attached herself to Dinah in a fashion that went to her heart. It was Miss Isabel's wish that she should take care of her. She told her tremulously, and Dinah knew it had been equally her friend's wish that she should care for Biddy. And Biddy was very good. Probably in accordance with Scott's desire, she made an effort to throw off all gloom, and undoubtedly her own sense of loss and bereavement was greatly lessened by the consciousness of Dinah's need for her. "Time enough to weep later," she told herself as she lay down in the room adjoining Dinah's on that first night in the dower house. "She'll not be wanting old Biddy when Master Scott comes to her." The 2 days that followed were very fully occupied. There were curtains and pictures to hang, furniture to be arranged, and many things to be unpacked. Dinah went to work with zest. She did not know when Scott would come, but it would be soon. She knew it would be soon, and she thrilled to the thought. Everything must be ready for him. She wanted him to feel that it was home from the moment he crossed the threshold. So, with Biddy's help, she went about her preparations, enlisting the old nurse's sympathies, till at last she succeeded in arousing her enthusiasm also. There was certainly no time to weep. That second day after her arrival was the day of the funeral. It was a beautiful still day of summer, and in the afternoon Dinah and Biddy sat in the garden overlooking the winding river, and read the burial service together. It was Dinah's suggestion, somewhat shyly proffered, and though she knew it not, from that time forward Biddy's heart was at her feet. Whatever tears there might be yet to shed had lost all bitterness from that hour. "I'll never be lonely as so long as there's you to love, Miss Dinah, darlint," Biddy murmured when the young arms closed about her neck for a moment ere they went back to their work. "You've warmed and comforted me all through." It was late in the evening, when dusk was falling, that there came the sound of an uneven tread on the gravel path before the dower house. Dinah was the first to hear it. Dinah, wearing one of Biddy's voluminous aprons, and mounted on a pair of steps, arranging china on a high shelf that ran round the old square hall. The front door was open, and the birds were singing in the gloaming. She had been listening to them while she worked, when suddenly this new sound came. Her heart gave a wild leap and stood still. She had not expected him tonight. She sat down on the top of the steps with a swift, indescribable rush of feeling that seemed to deprive her of all her strength. She could not have said for the moment if she were glad or dismayed at the sound of that quiet footfall. But she was quite powerless to go and meet him. A great wave of shyness engulfed her, possessing her, overwhelming her. He entered. He came straight to her. She wondered afterwards what he must have thought of her, sitting there on her perch, in burning embarrassment, with no word or sign of welcome. But whatever he thought, he dealt with the situation with unerring instinct. He mounted a couple of steps with hands stretched up to hers. "Why, my Dinah," he said, "how busy you are. Let me help." Her heart throbbed again, fast and hard, but still for a few seconds she could not speak. She stooped with a soft, endearing sound and laid her face upon the hands that clasped her own. He suffered her for a moment or two in silence. She thought his hands trembled slightly. Then, "Let's get finished, little wife," he said gently. "Isn't the day's work nearly over? Can't we take off our sandals and rest?" "I have just done," she said, finding her voice. "Biddy and I have got through such a lot. Oh, Scott," as the light fell upon his face, "how tired you look." "It has been a rather tiring day," he made answer. "I didn't think I could get over here tonight, but Eustace insisted." "How good of him," she said with quick gratitude. "Yes, he is good." Scott's voice was tender. "I couldn't sleep last night, and he came into my room and we had a long talk. He is one of the best, Dinah, one of the best. I'm afraid you've made rather a poor exchange." Something in his tone banished the last of Dinah's shyness. She gave him her basket of china and prepared to descend. He stretched up a courteous hand to help her, but she would have none of it. "You are never to say that or anything like it again," she said severely. "If you weren't so dreadfully tired, I believe I'd be really angry. As it is," she reached the ground and stood there before him, a small, purposeful figure, clad in the great apron that wrapped about her like a garment. "As it is," he suggested meekly, setting the basket on a chair and turning back to face her. Two quivering hands came out to him in the gloaming and fastened resolutely on his coat. "Oh, Greatheart," whispered a tremulous voice, "I love you so much, so much. I want to kiss you." "My darling," answered Greatheart softly, "you can't want it more than I do." His arms closed about her. He drew her to his breast. "Arrah, then, what would I cry for at all?" said Biddy, as she lay down that night. "I've got her to myself, and Master Scott to care for, and maybe some day the Almighty will remember old Biddy for good and give her another little one into her care." "And you left them quite happy?" smiled Rose to her lover 2 days later. "It's a very suitable arrangement, isn't it? I always used to think that Dinah and your brother should make a match." "Oh, quite suitable," agreed Eustace lazily, an odd blend of irony and satisfaction in his tone. "They will be happy enough. Stumpy, you know, is just the sort of chivalrous ass that a child like Dinah can appreciate. They'll probably live in the 7th heaven and fancy that no one else has ever been within 1,000,000 miles of it." "Poor little Dinah," murmured Rose. "She will never know what she has missed." "And just as well, perhaps," said Sir Eustace with his faintly cynical smile. End of chapter 29. End of Greatheart by Ethel M. Dell.